bearing in mind that this does record, so if you do decide you need to go and do something else for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever, then you could obviously, if you would like to know what was said in the bit you've missed, you can listen to the recording once it appears on the screen, or uploading, whatever the term is. So I'll leave it to people to decide for themselves. If you would like me to stagger a break into it, do say, but if you're happy for me to ramble on inanely until I run out of things to say, then let me know that as well. It would be brilliant. So we're now, okay, so 2 o'clock just gone, so if we make a formal start. So hello to everyone who is logged in. I can see what we've got. Sarah, Reese, Kevin, Leah, and possibly a few other people as well, maybe. 7 people logged in at the moment. So the idea for this afternoon's session is partly to get my brain back into gear of teaching, where the students don't actually, the degree students, I've got other students back already, but the degree students don't start back for a couple of weeks, so this is just to get my brain functioning, if you can call it that, after a fashion, ready for that. And also I thought this might actually be a subject of genuine interest to fellow pagans. It may also, of course, appeal to people who aren't pagan at all, but are interested in Jung, or just, even if they're not practicing pagans, they might have an interest in mythology or something or another that leads them to want to know more about this subject. So I'm going to work on the assumption that most of the people listening to this will be pagans with at least some degree of experience of ritual and reading mythology and so forth. If there's anyone who is listening who is maybe very new to paganism or is not pagan at all and is here because of their interest in Jung, or I don't know, just sheer bloody boredom and something to do with a wet afternoon, then by all means ask questions in the typed comments section. So if I'm using terms that some people are not familiar with, do shout out and I'll explain what those terms mean. I will explain the Jungian terms as we go along, so I know some of you are definitely, Kevin, Reese certainly, and Carol, I think, is here somewhere, certainly are well read around Jung, so a lot of these terms you will already know, probably most of them actually, if not all of them. But there may be some people who are less familiar with Jung, so I will explain the psychological jargon. But if you want explanations of the pagan jargon, then chip into the comments and I'll put something in there to help us to go along. I have very, very high-tech bits of paper with words written on them, so if any of you are interested in some of the terms and you're not familiar with them, and you kind of, sometimes it's easier to see things written down than just hear them. Some people grasp concepts better when they see it written down. So there's probably some very clever way in which I could type directly and make things appear on the screen, but as I'm as thick as shit when it comes to technology, I don't know how to do that, which is why I'm going to be using bits of paper. Old school, basically. So, where to begin? This is in a vaguely kind of coherent order, in that I wrote a load of ideas down and then put them in what I thought was a reasonably sensible sequence to go in. But we'll see how reasonable that is as we go along. In applying the ideas of Jung, just to put it in a bit of historical context, Carl Jung was born in Switzerland in 1875 and popped his clogs in 1961. Had obviously a very long life, a remarkably entertaining and engaging life. Did all sorts of weird and wonderful things and travelled around the world and was fascinated by mythology. Now, I need to say at this juncture, for anyone who doesn't already know this, as I'm sure some of you do, but some of you won't, Carl Jung was not himself, as far as anyone knows, a practicing pagan. He was fascinated by mythology and read probably more than a lot of 21st century pagans actually read around the subject of myths and stories from cultures around the world. An incredibly well-read man, and felt that mythology was a way of understanding the human psyche and understanding what people unlike it, internally, he saw mythology essentially as a psychodrama, a way of understanding the consciousness. Okay. I'm right. I'm not sure how. Okay, my microphone is turned up to full here. I'm not sure. Maybe if I sit a little bit closer to the screen, I wonder if that will help pick up on sound. Is that any better? Hopefully that might make it easier, and I'll try and speak a bit louder as well. I'm not wholly sure how to, aside from the little speaker thing in the corner, I'm not sure how to change sound. Oh, hello, Carol. Okay, so if somebody can give me a bit of feedback as to whether the sound is now better, is it easier to hear, or still a bit quiet? Okay, no comments on that. Right, well, if I keep burbling on anyway. So we're saying that Jung himself was not, so far as anybody knows, a practicing pagan or a subscriber to any one singular religion. He was a bit of a universalist who took, oh, hello, Gavin, took the idea that all religion, which is a very pluralist approach, very commonly found in amongst the Vedic religions around India and the Indian diaspora, that all religions are essentially an attempt to comprehend a universal truth, or actually a whole set of universal truths, a whole interlocking series of truths. And therefore, whether you're Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or a Druid or a Wiccan or, I don't know, Shintoist, whatever the hell you might be, you are still capable of approaching okay, I'll shuffle it even closer to the microphone. There we go. You'll be able to see right up my nose in a minute. That'll be an unpleasant experience, you're all concerned. It's a way of understanding and comprehending these vast cosmic truths. The truths, as far as Jung was concerned, were primarily truths of the human consciousness, more so than sort of profound truths of the outer cosmos. So it's not so much understanding the truth of the afterlife or how the universe was created or anything like that, but rather that mythology, and by mythology we're not just only talking pagan mythology, but the sacred stories of Muslims and Hindus and Jews and Buddhists and Christians and everybody else, these are ways of understanding the human psyche and exploring our own inner depths. Now obviously, because we're going to focus on paganism for this, I won't talk much at all about those other mythologies, but if any of you do have an interest in other forms of religion, non-pagan religion, then what I'm going to say about the Jungian understanding of paganism could as easily apply to most other religions as well. You'd just be changing the set of stories a little bit and taking it in a slightly different function. Now, I've done a number of other podcasts around the teachings of Jung. I'm hesitant to repeat them too much because some of you might actually listen to some of those earlier things, and it'll get a little bit boring if I just say the same old stuff again and again. But some of it does bear a bit of a recap, especially for anybody who's not listened to the previous stuff or read books giving these sorts of ideas. A common feature of Wicca, of Hellenic paganism, Greek paganism, and those forms of modern day paganism that have a kind of a domino association with Wicca, in as much as they're not actually Wiccan per se, but they have taken ideas from Wicca, so they're a kind of a knock-on experience from Wicca, if you see what I mean. Take the Greek idea, the ancient Greek idea of, oh good, sounds much better, good, thank you. The ancient Greek idea of the four elements, earth, air, fire and water. And Jung was fascinated by this idea and how widespread it was. Now, if you go to other parts of the planet, so if you're going to Japan or to Africa or to Australia, by which I'm talking about the Aboriginal cultures, not modern day Australians, but the pre-European Australian cultures, what you'll find is not always earth, air, fire and water. So many of those cultures have notions of elementalism, that the world is composed of these vast cosmic forces, and everything in the world is composed of a combination of these presences, these elements, whatever you want to call them, but not necessarily framed as a set of 4. Sometimes it's a set of 5, sometimes it's a set of 7, sometimes it's a different number, and not always earth, air, fire, water, it's sometimes other things as well. As far as Jung was concerned, whatever the language, whatever the exact structure, it was an attempt to understand the interconnectedness of all life. That all things are composed of, interlinked with, part of a greater system. And therefore we all participate of elements of this greater system. Now you can find in Norse myth stories of Ymir the giant. That way back at the beginning of the cosmos, there was this vast block of ice, and this cosmic cow came along and licked the block of ice. When it was all sort of licked away, as it were, frozen inside and rapidly defrosting inside this vast cosmic block of ice was the giant Ymir. And the world is created by the dismemberment of Ymir's body, so that his skull becomes the heavens, and one eye the sun, and one eye the moon, his blood the oceans, and so forth. You've got a near identical story in early Taoist Chinese mythology about not the bit with the cow and the ice, but the idea of a giant whose body is chopped up and becomes the bones, the mountains, the flesh becomes the earth, and so forth. So the body becomes the composition of everything that exists, including, of course, all of the plants and the animals and the humans, and we are animals, that exist upon the planet. So we are all part and parcel of the same interconnecting forces. The recurrence of that sort of idea in many cultures, usually of a giant, sometimes of a different sort of a creature, which is dismembered, chopped up, and from which the earth comes into manifestation. It was taken by Jung, and indeed many earlier thinkers, particularly within the alchemical schools, as representative of the idea that all life is interconnected, that we are made of the same stuff as the trees, as the mountains, as the clouds, as the stars, as the rivers. Therefore everything participates of each other. So elementalism as a doctrine builds on this idea that we're all interconnected. But for Jung, he wasn't overly interested in the mythologies that had sets of 5 elements or 7 elements or 9 elements or what have you. He was primarily interested in Greek myth and the representation of 4 elements, and its dominance into Western astrology. So the kind of astrology you can read in Russell Grant's newspaper column, in whichever newspaper it is that he writes, I can't remember which one he writes for now. But the kinds of things you'll find there are based upon ancient Greek astrology, as I'm sure you all know anyway. For Jung, he rejigs a little bit the 4 elements. So instead of talking in terms of air and water, he talks in terms of thinking function and feeling function. Instead of talking in terms of earth and fire, he talks in terms of sensation function and intuition function. It's essentially the same thing, but just rephrased a little bit and understood from a slightly different point of view. What interests him is not so much an attempt to argue against the periodic table and that understanding of the composite elements of the universe. Rather, it's an attempt to say this is less about what chairs and tables and trees and mountains and rivers are composed of, and it's more an understanding of what the human mind is composed of. So we have a thinking function, we have our intellect, our rationality, our capacity for logical, interlinked, progressive thinking. We have our feeling capacity. We have our emotions, our love and hate and hope and fear, and our ability to nurture both self-care, to look after ourselves, but also to nurture other people and animals and pot plants and anything else that we might want to go and nurture, to pour out our love. And equally, you can of course pour out your hate in a very destructive fashion, but to utilize that feeling function. We have our sensation function, our capacity for pragmatism, for organization, for bodily comfort and being in tune with the needs of our body so that we eat healthily and sleep enough and brush our teeth and comb our hair and look after our bodies and exercise and are very rooted in our bodies and by extension rooted in our five senses. So we can enjoy music and bird song and the aroma of roses and the feel of freshly laundered bed sheets and all the rest of it. We have that sensuality about us, that pleasure in the physical realm of life. And we have the intuitive capacity, all of us, that leap of the imagination where, a bit like Sherlock Holmes, you can walk into a room and within 30 seconds work out what's going on, because your mind, at a phenomenal speed, interlinks a dozen different ideas and creates a cohesive picture from disparate little bits. And we call that a leap of intuition, a leap of the imagination, to go from the basics to the conclusion within a matter of split seconds. We're all capable of that, not maybe as efficiently as Sherlock Holmes is in the books, but it's something we all have a capacity for. And we have imagination, we can dream, we can fantasize, we might be able to compose novels, tell stories, write poems, come up with song lyrics, envision a cake and then go and bake it, embroider stuff, weave cloth, all forms of creativity that we can engage in and interact with and flow. We have all of those capacities within us. Where Jung returns to the idea of elementalism as it was understood by Empedocles, the ancient Greek philosopher, is that Empedocles said, I mean, he wasn't as interested in the psychological angle, because that hadn't quite birthed the way it would go on to come to fruition under Sigmund Freud and Wundt and the various others. But for Empedocles, one major application of elementalism was to health, the health of the body and the health of the mind. And there he takes an idea which you can also find in Chinese medicine, you can find it in Ayurvedic medicine in India, you can find it in lots of different sources around the world. The notion that these various elements exist, whether it's envisioned as a set of 4 or a set of 5, a set of however many, these elements exist and they need to exist in harmony, in balance with each other. When they go out of balance, one of them gets very, very strong and the others get very, very weak, then in the long term that will lead to imbalance and therefore to ill health. And disease is understood as dis-ease, to not be at ease, to not be at an equilibrium, at a balance, at a harmonious whole. Now that may be a disease of the body, or it may be a disease of the mind, and if you want to get more abstract still, it may be a disease of the soul, caused by an imbalance. And so in ancient Greece, one of the jobs of physicians was to evaluate people's balance, to work out what they had too much of and what they had not enough of. It's the same in Ayurvedic medicine, the same in Chinese traditional medicine, and other medical practices in other parts of the world. There's suggestions of something similar in early medieval Irish medicine, for example. It's about assessing, all right, you've got too much of this, not enough of that. We need to do something to rectify this balance and get these back into an equilibrium, into a harmony. And sometimes that's a matter of diet. You need to eat foods that have more of this element in and less foods that have that too strong of an element that you have in your body. And sometimes it's through exercise, sometimes it's through more kind of herbal interventions and medicines or spiritual forms of healing. It depends on which bit of the world we're looking at. But there are different ways of trying to rectify that balance in the self. Now, within Wicca and those forms of paganism that are offshoots of Wicca, you have the idea of casting the circle. and the circle has an eastern quarter and southern quarter, or western quarter and northern quarter, and that matches up with Empedocles' ideas of earth, air, fire and water. And if we then extend the application to Jung, you can say, as well as understanding earth as being the mountains and the fields, and water as being the oceans and the rivers, you can also think of the circle as representing the earth is your body, the north is your body, the west is your emotions, the east your intellect, the south your imaginative, intuitive function. Yep, absolutely, Carol. He makes huge leaps of intuition. Sometimes too huge, you might argue, but yeah, intuition plays a massive part in his writings, and his creativity and his love of dreams, for example. And mythology, that is all very much part of that intuitive, what Empedocles would have called the fire function of the personality. So this is a way of understanding the mind, the psyche, bearing in mind that that word, psychology, psyche, comes from the ancient Greek word for soul, that the soul is a composite of these different forces merged together, like ingredients in a cake, I suppose, which I'm only talking about because I'm such a fat git and I eat too much cake. It's this balance of ingredients, of forces, whatever term you want to use, of elements, which can very easily be tilted out of balance. For those, and I do appreciate, before anyone says, I do appreciate that there are plenty of pagan traditions that do not use a circle in their ritual. So this bit at least, is only applicable to certain forms of pagan practice. But for those pagan practices that do use that application, visualizing the circle, whether that's just somebody sitting in an armchair visualizing it, or whether you've actually created a circle upon the floor and you've got candles and your incense and you're going for the full works, can be understood as a form of psychological therapy. That having created this space, you are calling your own existence into focus. Now, clearly your existence is already there, otherwise you wouldn't have been able to cast the circle in the first place if it didn't exist. But you are centering yourself, your focus, your awareness on your own existence, particularly if it's a solitary ritual. If it's a group ritual, then you could argue each person is kind of doing the same thing, but in a series of parallel, should we say bubbles? That's a bit of a COVID-y type word at the moment, isn't it? So each person has their own circle, even though they're all in a shared one big circle. So yeah, it's a slightly different tack for a group ritual. But one thing to do is to think about yourself as a composite of these factors, these four forces, and to think, what is there too much of? In my case, too much cake, too much flesh. I expect a lot of people at the moment actually with lockdown, too much of everything. But it may be that you're too emotionally gushy, or you're too dry and intellectual and a bit of a cold fish. It may be you're too materialistic, or you're too carried away with fairies and flights of imagination, and you're totally ungrounded. So you've got something perhaps within you that is in excess, is too much of that. And by extension and implication, that's the sort of the dominant function, the superior function, but by extension there is an inferior function, one of the other three, that there is very little of in you. And for Jung, and here he does echo the ideas of Empedocles very much so, the notion is if these forces, although there's a set of four, they really are a set of two pairs. And so if there's too much sensation, you'll have a dearth of intuition, because it'll be the one on the opposite side of the circle that's the inferior function. If there's too much feeling, there'll be too little thinking, and vice versa. So it's not the case that you would perhaps have too much thinking but not enough sensation. You're more likely to have too little of the opposite to the one that's dominant. So the opposite one becomes the presence in darkness, because the focus, the concentration of light, what you see most of, and what other people around you who know you well will see most of, is the one of the four that is primarily in the light. Think of that in stage terminology. You've got the line, not the spotlight. Sorry, the spotlight coming down on you and focusing on you as an actor on stage in that one mode. So most people will tend to see you in one of those four modes. That's what they'll see most of. You still have the other three, but not many people get to see you exhibiting the other three. And you probably don't get to see yourself exhibiting the other three. There's a sociologist called Erving Goffman who developed dramaturgical theory, which is this argument, and it's only one of his ideas, there's lots of other ideas, but dramaturgical theory is the notion that we are all actors, darling, lovey, strutting upon the stage of life. And just as an actor will step out onto the stage, or if it's a film, in front of the cameras when they're rolling, and be one thing, when they step back into the wings or the cameras turn off, they become something else. And we can think of famous examples. The obvious one that leaps to my mind, which is a reflection of my age, is Rock Hudson. The sort of macho leading man with beautiful women swooning on his arm, not only in the camera and the films, but when he was attending premieres and Hollywood swanky parties, he would always turn up with a glamorous woman on his arm to get out of the limousines with. And of course, in private, he was as gay as a very big gay thing. Noticeably different from his on-screen rugged persona. Not only gay, but quite effeminate off camera. Whereas on camera, he was very, very manly, very rugged. So two very different people. Is one fake and one real? Well, Goffman's argument, and I think this is where it intersects with a degree of interest with Jung, is that actually that's a stupid question. Both are real, and both, in a sense, are fake. Because if Rock Hudson had no capacity to exhibit macho qualities, he would not have been able to fake it for the cameras. Oh, I say fake it. He wouldn't have been able to exaggerate for the cameras if there was no capacity whatsoever for that kind of behaviour within him. So he must have drawn on something that was there, but obviously because of the demands of Hollywood and the period of history he lived in, and for that being gay was illegal and all the rest of it, for a large chunk of his life, he learnt to present a front which took some elements of his personality, put them into the limelight or into the spotlight, and greatly exaggerated them. And then as soon as he was backstage off camera, other aspects of his personality, which were equally as real, they came to the fore. And so it's often the case that when we interact, not with celebrities and famous people, but just friends, family, work colleagues, next door neighbour, what have you, we interact with people. Goffman's argument is that when you meet another person, you start to go in a bit like the thing about the show ponies getting a whiff of the grease paint and then kind of putting on a performance, that you start to slip into the role which is your public performance role. And that can even be with very close friends and very close family, not just random strangers, but the tendency to put on a face. Am I putting on a face at the moment? Well, obviously, because I'm not doing this every minute of every day, so I'm not like this every minute of every day. You're seeing a bit of me. Perhaps what you're seeing at the moment, I guess, would be the thinking function. That element, because I'm thinking and I'm using ideas and I'm trying to interlink logical ideas together. You're not seeing the gushy emotional me. You're not seeing the physical me shoveling cake down my throat like a starving man. You're not, well, perhaps to a point you are seeing a bit of the intuitive me, because the very nature of the topic we're talking about, there's a degree of intuition going on, so maybe a little bit of that. But you're seeing certain aspects. Therefore, there is an element of performance, an element of putting on a role. And the other bits are the backstage bits that don't get seen in public so much. Now, as far as Goffman is concerned, the backstage bits might be backstage for a number of reasons. It may be that they're just not required very often. There's not much call for them, therefore the person doesn't exhibit those traits, those qualities, those skills very often. or it may be that they are stigmatized, and Goffman was very interested in the idea of stigma. So back to Rock Hudson again, he lived in a period of history when being gay was at one stage illegal, and then even after it stopped being illegal, it was very unpopular in the sense of being a career killer for celebrities. So he kept that bit of himself backstage because it was stigmatized, and he was worried about the reaction from other people: hostility, violence, loss of career, etc. So there may be bits of ourselves that we keep hidden because we don't, or either we know other people react badly, or at least we think they might. So we keep those bits of ourselves hidden because we're ashamed of them, or we're embarrassed about them, or we don't want to be arrested or beaten up or something or another. And so into the shadow goes the stigmatized. And this is, again, coming back into Jung's arguments, in that he said we have an unconscious mind, as Freud said. Jung had been a student of Freud until they had a huge hissy fit and stopped talking to each other. Freud had huge hissy fits with everyone. All of his students, well, almost all of them, he fell out with at some point and never spoke to again. But Jung was the golden boy he thought would inherit the throne. And so when they fell out, boy did they fall out big time. One of the disagreements between Freud and Jung was Jung's suggestion that not only do we have our own individual unconscious mind, that bit of us that comes into action when we're asleep and dreaming, or when we're going into that kind of zombie autopilot mode and we're doing something really boring and we barely notice what's going on in the world around us, we're going off with fairies, and something takes over from us, and sometimes we find we've done odd things and can't remember doing them. Like when you open the fridge and you realise you put your mobile phone in the fridge and you've got absolutely no bloody idea why you did it, or even when you did it, because your mind was elsewhere and your unconscious was operating. Not only do we have that individual unconscious, but Jung said we have a collective unconscious. We patch our minds into every other living human on the planet. Both all of the, 7.5 billion or something people alive on the planet at the moment, but also, and this is where we again overlap into paganism, we are connected to all the people who have been alive in the past, but are no longer with us. Our ancestors, both our biological ancestors, our immediate genetic lineage, but also any other random dead person that's ever existed on the planet has participated in the collective unconscious. And so we join with them, we interact with them, which is not something that Freud went along with. Freud, that was a load of old mumbo jumbo. But Jung was very, very passionate about that. And so what we have here, you might argue, is a form of not necessarily ancestor worship in the Monty Python, oh, you are so wonderful, sense of being oleaginous about worship, but rather in the Anglo-Saxon sense of Riath Shub, which is the origin of where the word worship comes from. Riath, to give value, to give worth, that which you value. And shopper is where we get the word shopper, to the act of giving, but also it's where we get the word shape from, to shape something. So if you worship something, you give value to it, and by giving value to it, you shape it, but also it shapes you. It's a two-way street. You are reflected. Excuse me. You are reflected, choking, in the things you value. So for those of you who are parents, I dare say at some point with your children, you might have had to have words with them about hanging out with the wrong crowd, because the concern that the value they placed on the friendships they've had with some dodgy little Herbert who might lead them astray is such that they are befriending a wrong crowd. They are valuing the wrong kinds of people, the kinds of people who will endanger them or corrupt them or mislead them or whatever. And so it's very important to be cautious of what you value, what you appreciate. and therefore what you worship, not in the bow down, kiss your feet sense of worship, but merely in the sense of that which you value. And the Anglo-Saxon perspective of worship, to give value to your friends, to your family members, to your dog, your cat, your gerbil, your goldfish, to your house, to your car, to your collection of books or CDs or whatever it is you like. All of that is part and parcel of a spectrum of valuing, which includes the value we give to the gods. And as we were talking about in the data a few minutes ago, to the ancestors. So the connections you have to them, it's all a form of worship. It's simply a matter of scale, of interconnection between the little amount of value you give to small things, the amount of value I give to gin. I like gin, but I don't kind of bow and scrape to it. But it is, I could live without it, but I do like it. So a small amount of value, all the way up to the much grander scales of value that we give to people, to ideas, to presences, to certain objects, certain places that form a massive significance to our lives, the loss of which would be deeply damaging to us. So the worship of the divine is not significantly different from the worthship, the giving of worth to your family, your friends, your favourite TV show, your favourite book. It's all part and parcel of the perspective, and it all helps to shape the person we become. And on the receiving end of that, if you are valued by someone else, another human being, a friend, a relative, your pet dog, your boss at work, whoever it is that values you, this is assuming you know they value you, of course, because you might not know, but if you know that they value you, that changes you. To be in receipt of value changes you as a person, it shapes you as a person. So when we're talking about ancestor worship, it's not meant in that rather Victorian leaden way that it's often envisaged, even in a lot of rather dated religious books. Rather, it is simply the act of giving value to those who have died, those who have gone before. I was born in London, lived there for quite a long time. I'm not sure what age I was when I discovered that Bazalgette had created the London sewer system, but having learnt about the invention of the London sewer system and what life was like before Bazalgette invented the London sewer system, when people were, well, let's face it, pissing and shitting in pots and throwing it out the window, I value him. I've never met him, or I've never had any mystic psychic contact with him, but I can value the works of people who have gone before, whether that's the works of great artists, whether it's the works of people who built sewer systems, and that not just him as the planner of it, but all those navvies with shovels digging out the mud and putting up the tiles and bricks and things. To value those people who have gone before, most of whom, when it comes to the ones with the shovels, I don't know what their names are, most people don't know what their names are, but to value their existence, that they have made a world that is good for me to live in. Just as we can value, maybe for the women who are listening to this, you may well value, I'm assuming here that you vote, you might not care about voting, I don't know. But if you do vote, you might well value Emmeline Pankhurst and all the various other women over the decades who tied themselves to railings and one thing and another in order to get you the right to vote and do all sorts of other things which they couldn't do in their lifetime, but are now commonplace for women in the 21st century Europe and the Western world in general. So whether you know their names or you don't know their names, you can be in receipt of things that past generations have created. And so the act of valuing what they have done is as much an act of worship as lighting candles, burning incense, prancing around in a floaty purple frock, and going woo 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 on a regular basis. These are acts of value, acts of worship, acts of appreciation. And really this is this notion of the collective unconscious. When we are tuning into this greater force, it's been, the bedrock of it has been laid by hundreds upon hundreds of generations of dead people who have shaped the way human consciousness works now. And that is one of the arguments from Jung. It's also an argument echoed by many people who are otherwise very, very cynical about the sorts of ideas that Jung spoke of. The notion that you don't, even someone as dreary as Judith Butler, his American sociologist, argues that our ideas of masculinity and femininity are not made out of thin air by us. We are born into a culture which has had hundreds upon hundreds of generations of people shaping these ideas, and we inherit them. We grow up absorbing ideas that have been laid down century upon century upon century by other people, and they become part of us. So we absorb the dead, the ideas of the dead, not just their DNA, but their ideas, their concepts, their laws, their music, their art, their architecture, their notions of clothing and technology and a million other things. We absorb them as we grow up, and they become second nature to us. Just as one day when we're all dead and gone, there'll be younger generations absorbing what we have left for them. And if they appreciate what they get, they will be engaging in an act of worship, giving worth to us. So even once you're dead, not only is your legacy left around in a material sense, like the legacy of the London sewers as physical bricks and water and what have you, but we are part of this, our ideas, our feelings, our understandings are part of this collective cosmos, this collective unconscious mind, to which every single human being is an inheritor. Now, one element where we could go off a little bit even more woo-woo than we already are, which would branch away from them, and more down the pagan line, particularly the animist pagan line, is to suggest, which I genuinely believe is true, that this collective unconscious, the human end of it, is like if you like, an iceberg floating in the water, and there are other icebergs also floating in the water. So there is a collective unconscious of dogs, of cats, of horses, of gerbils, of oak trees, and that ultimately all life interconnects. So when we are understanding things from a shamanic point of view, people going on spirit quests, visionary journeys, and changing shape in their minds, not physically, but in their minds, becoming a bird or a horse or a wolf or a beetle or something or another. What I'd suggest, that maybe some of it is an exercise in imagination, but I think there is the capacity there to touch the collective unconsciousness of other non-human beings. And so in some cultures, when they talk about the great wolf spirit or the great eagle spirit, what I'd suggest they are describing and labelling in that way is the collective unconsciousness of the wolf, of the eagle, of the dolphin, whatever it might be. Chuck that one in for Carol. It's a way of touching upon another experience. And in those, which is actually most cultures around the world have traditions of shape-shifting, of people who can become different animals for a period of time. I think what we're describing there, in story form, poetic form, is people who can enter into a trance state, and some of them at least migrate beyond their own human consciousness, their own human collective unconsciousness, and to touch upon, for a brief period of time, the unconsciousness of a different species. And again, I think that's a two-way street. So it's not just us being able to touch their consciousness. I'm sure as equally they, members of that these other species, are capable of sensing each other's consciousness and sensing, let's see, Greg, blame Greg, sensing human consciousness. It's a way of interacting between the species, and a lot of what we understand within animism and shamanism, I think, is an interaction between the collected consciousnesses as well as individual consciousnesses of whole species. So the human unconsciousness is but one, in a sense. Now that's not something Jung said. That's me chucking this into the pot, my own take upon this matter. I don't think it's contained to animals. Plants, I believe, have their own consciousness of different types of plants, and mushrooms and so forth. And maybe wine, animism around the world, time and again you find stories of the gods of the mountain, like Molas in Greek myth, the god of the mountain. Maybe mass geographic forces, like mountains or oceans, can also have unconsciousness, or consciousness, I'm not quite sure which word I mean there. But something that can be sensed and intuited. And so this idea of Jung, that within the collective unconsciousness there are patterns of common experience, and these common experiences built up over hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of generations form what Jung called archetypes. So that there is an archetype of motherhood, the great mother, because there have been, I don't know how many billions of mothers, human mothers, in the existence of the human race. And every single human mother there's ever been has, through her link between her individual consciousness and the collective unconsciousness, imprinted notions of motherhood on the collective unconsciousness, as well as received them. So back to that, what we were saying a little earlier about Butler and growing up and absorbing the culture around you. So you absorb from your culture a notion of what motherhood involves. And then when you experience it yourself, you add your own unique imprint upon the collective unconscious. And also, of course, not just being a mother, but having a mother. So whether you are a daughter or a son, you will know what it's like to have a mother. And she may be a very good mother or a very bad mother or a kind of somewhere in the middle type mother. But whatever the experience, that again is contributed to the collective. So the experience both of the mothers themselves, but also the experiences of the children of mothers. And that forms to the collective. Now, one ongoing debate that happens within pagan circles is whether the gods are archetypes or separate from archetypes. So take Demeter, the Greek mother goddess, the mother of the earth, or Mother Earth I should say rather. Is she the archetype of motherhood as understood by the Greeks, and therefore exactly the same as Danu, the Irish archetype of Mother Earth, Mother Water, the Great Mother? Or are they separate, distinct notions? Now, it depends entirely on your personal theological stance and point of view. And I'm sure put 10 pagans in a room and you'll get 57 answers as to how they understand that notion. So I'll give you my slant, and obviously some of you might chuck in a comment or two as we go along as to whether you agree, disagree, whatever else. I would say no. Archetypes are not gods, but gods partake of archetypes in the same way that we do. What do I mean by that? My job is as a lecturer, or if you prefer a teacher. That's an archetype. The teacher is an archetype. Now, I am not an archetype. I am not a walking archetype. However, when I am at work and I put my teaching hat on, as it were, I am participating in the archetype of teacher because I'm absorbing notions from umpty generations as to what teaching involves. This has got nothing to do with frickin' Ofsted, but with teachers all the way back to ancient Sumeria and beyond, notions of what teachers do and don't do and how they should behave and what they, all the rest of it. I'm an inheritor of all of that, and I have my own experience, my good days and my bad days and my indifferent days of teaching. And my students will equally, just as having talked about mothers and children of mothers, so there's teachers and students of teachers. So not only does each teacher absorb the traditions, the archetypes of teaching, and then add their own two penny's worth on top of it, but so the students of teachers bring their cultural inheritance of teaching to the classroom and have their individual interactions with each given teacher, some good, some bad, some indifferent, and that adds to that archetype. So I am partaking in that archetype, but it's not the entirety of my being, because I also partake in other archetypes. I'm a man, so I partake in the archetypes of masculinity. I can be understood in all sorts of different. I'm a storyteller. I partake in the archetypes of storytelling. There's 12 different archetypes that I can partake in. So I am a composite of little bits of different archetypes, if you like, as we each are. But as a Gestalt being, I am more than the sum of my parts, as we each are more than the sum of our parts. And I think the gods, in a similar way, partake of archetypes. So Demeter will partake of the mother archetype, but just as any human mother does, and yet that woman is more than only a mother, exists above and beyond that. So Demeter is more than an earth mother archetype, partakes of it but is greater than it. So it's a kind of, my experience is that just as having what we're saying about worship in the Anglo-Saxon sense, that the devotion given to the gods is part of a continuum in the same line as the value, the worth we give to our pets, our friends, our family, our possessions. So just as I have experience of archetypes, but I'm more than an archetype, that's part of a continuum of how I, as a relatively complicated being, interact with these forces. And so the gods, as fucking big, really super duper complicated beings, are at the other end of that scale, that spectrum. So I'm somewhere down this end, and the gods are somewhere up that end of this similar thing, but bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as it goes along, and more complex. So when we come to look at the gods, and this is, I think, a limitation that stems from a lot of books written about mythology by people who don't believe in them. So people, Victorians and Edwardians, what have you, writing books of Greek myth, Roman myth, Chinese myth, whatnot, where they are just treating them as quaint stories, not treating them as sacred tales. Who then end up saying, oh, well, Apollo is the sun god. Well, yes, he is. He is a god associated with the sun. But saying Apollo is a sun god is like saying, I am Ginger. Well, yes, I am. But that isn't exactly the defining feature of the entirety of my being. That's one aspect of my existence. It's not the entirety of my existence. And so for Apollo, his links to the sun, absolutely he has them, but that's one part of his existence. It's not the entirety of it. And therefore he's not interchangeable with any other random sun god chosen from some other culture. So I don't think you can do that kind of cardboard cut and paste thing, that this god is somehow interchangeable with that god because they're both vaguely like each other in some context. They've both got something or another to do with the sea, therefore they're the same being. No. Any more than I am the same being as the other teachers who work at the college. We're not all one amorphous blob of teacheriness that can somehow be interchanged with each other. We are individual beings who partake in an aspect of our lives in the archetype of teaching. I existed, clearly, before I became a teacher. And if I live long enough to retire, with this government, that'll be about when I'm 95. But if I live long enough to retire, I will be a post-teacher, an ex-teacher, a deceased teacher. I will be a teacher no longer. And so I will perhaps no longer participate in that archetype. Or will I? I mean, maybe it's a bit like a doctor, even once you've retired, you never quite stop. And some archetypes, when they get hold of you, don't like letting you go. Perhaps. But it's something we participate in. Is it the case, just as at one point in my life, I was not a teacher, then now I am a teacher, and one day, hopefully, I'll live long enough to retire and not be a teacher anymore. Is that the same case for Apollo? Was once upon a time he not a sun god, and now he is a sun god, and maybe in a squillion years' time he'll be a retired sun god and go and be something else instead. Perhaps. So I think there is a sense in which our understanding of human interaction with the divine can be charted over time. So if we look at early Roman interactions, very early Romans had the notion of the noumena, the grandiose spirited place, that you enter into that woodland glade or that seashore cove or that mountain top, and there is something there so numinous, which is where we get the word numinous from, numina, something so wondrous, so amazing, so strange, that our jaw drops. And we know it's not just, oh, pretty tree, it's looking at us. It is aware of us just as we are aware of it. That this is a live presence in this place, which is greater than the sum of its parts. So you go to that woodland glade and one day those trees will die and fall over and new trees will grow. But the presence will still be there, because the presence is more than the sum of the individual rocks and trees and bushes and whatnot in that glade. That is the noumena. And for the early Romans, the noumena was nameless. It was this presence. It was only through interaction with the Greeks and various other cultures that the notion of Roman gods got more and more complex, more and more, you could argue, humanized to a point in terms of human-shaped statues and so on to represent them. Took on more concrete identities, became more complex, merged sometimes to a point with each other, gained new areas of influence. So a god in one century may have been associated with one sphere of influence, and 100 years later 2 or 3 or 4 spheres of influence. So perhaps like somebody getting a job and acquiring new skills and expanding their identity, and the array of archetypes in which they partake, it gets bigger and bigger as your life goes on. Maybe it's not so very different for the divine, that it expands and grows and changes, and our understandings of it over the course of millennia. Maybe we are seeing different aspects of an eternal presence, at least if not actually eternal, as close as makes no difference for a human being. Or perhaps that entity is itself expanding and changing and becoming more than it was, becoming something greater. Perhaps sometimes entities coalesce, like amoebas in reverse, and become something that kind of combines what was previously 2 separate beings, then merge to become one strange, complex entity, perhaps. Anyway, I've gone completely off topic. So what I was also going to witter on about, going back to the 4 traits of the personality and the layout within the circle in Wicca and related pagan traditions, is that this process of having too much of one thing and not enough of the other, too much of one and not enough of the other, for Jung, and this is something I have mentioned in previous podcasts, but we'll recap it. There we go. It is called enantiodromia. If anyone's scribbling down that. Enantiodromia is a process that occurs naturally. Jung said that not only is your therapist trying to get you to balance out, but your inner drive is to achieve, if you like, the spark of your soul, if we can put it in such romantic terms, is to attain harmony. And when you become disharmonious, you become out of balance, diseased, that inner urging is something that another psychologist who died a couple of years ago, called James Hillman, referred to as the soul code. This kind of inner urging to bring you back to where you should be occurs. And as far as Jung is concerned, as far as Hillman is concerned, most archetypal psychologists are concerned, the world that is around us corresponds to the world that is within us. So that urges from within us are answered by events around us. And what that means in practice is that you can intentionally, through ritual, through therapy, through all sorts of activities, try to rebalance yourself. Fantastic. But if you don't, you're too busy rushing around in life to notice that you've got out of balance, then the world around you will try to force balance upon you, as it were. And the way it does so through Nanshadramya is that the inferior quality, the less developed quality of you, will come into your life, banging on your door, saying, "Let me in." And often it comes in a rather negative form. We've circulated around this idea of stigmatized traits and things pushed into the darkness, so we'll get back to talking about the shadow momentarily. The less developed part of our psyche often seems to us ugly, boring, unpleasant, dreary. Why would anyone be interested in that? Why would anyone value that part of me? No one ever has valued that part of me before, which is perhaps why it's undeveloped in the first place, because no one ever encouraged it to develop in the first place. They were busy encouraging other bits of you to develop instead. And so like a weak muscle that's been left to go slack, it's painful to use. And through Nanshadramya, other people will come into our life who are an embodiment of the thing we're not good at. But they won't necessarily come into our life in a very positive, friendly, upbeat fashion. They may come into our life as massive pains in the arse. People who are annoying and irritating and unpleasant to be around, and will persist in being annoying and irritating and unpleasant until such time, days, weeks, months, years later, that we learn to develop that undeveloped muscle. We learn to beef up that inferior function of our own psyche. Whereupon either we might see those people in a more positive light, because that bit of us has now developed and improved, or they might just go away because they're no longer really needed in our life. They no longer serve a function. And it's worth bearing in mind that you, me, we, could be the annoying buggers in other people's lives. So it's not just them being annoying buggers in our lives, we might be annoying them. So there may be occasions when we are pulled into somebody else's life because we are strong at the thing they are weak at. So we get under their skin, just as sometimes other people get under ours. And when you're wondering why on earth is this person in my life, it may be because you're there to assist them in developing that inferior function, that weaker element of their own psyche. As far as Jung is concerned, and obviously he was speaking as a therapist, 60 quid an hour or whatever, don't know how much he charged. It's better if you do this with intention. You set out to make yourself a more rounded person, rather than just kind of get buffeted by the winds of the collective unconscious into becoming a rounded person. So other people can push you into things, but it's better if you make the deliberate first intentional move yourself. And we're back to that idea of, in ceremonial magic, not so much paganism, but ceremonial magic, to know, to will, to be silent and dare, as those kind of four characteristics that define the the mage, the magus, the magician, on his or her path through occult realms, setting out to do things willingly. So it's not willfully, and this is to know to will. It doesn't mean being like a stroppy teenager being very willful and moody. It means to do things willingly, in a line with your own higher will, your own that soul code, to use James Hillman's phrase as well. It's also a title of one of his books. That spark that says, I know this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to stop kicking and screaming and pulling in any other direction. I'm going to go with the grain of the wood. I'm going to go with the flow of the ocean, because that's where, sort of paddling against the tide, going that way, I'm going to go that way because I can see the wisdom of the world around me, the wisdom of the world within me. There must be good purpose for the water, for the tide, or the winds, or whatever metaphor you want to use, to carry me in that direction, even though for years and years and years I've been desperately trying to go in that direction. But I now realise that direction is not good for me. That direction, the one that's bored me, annoyed me, irritated me, got on my wick, is the right direction to go in. And therefore I will go there with will. He gets around it as well, doesn't he? That becomes a form of self-development. And it can be done, I mean, Jung's whole point is that daily life is constant therapy. Not therapy in the sense of making you feel good, but therapy in the sense of trying to polish up your rough edges and push you in the certain directions and get you to do what is needed to be done. And when you do it, you will experience what Jung called synchronicity. This is this wonderful word where things fall into place. Odd coincidences happen. Good coincidences, positive coincidences, omens, symbols, signs. And he was quite a believer in things like tarot and astrology, not to predict the future so much, but the idea that life has an awareness, which is a very pagan notion, and this awareness will give you positive reinforcement through appropriate symbolic messages, through dreams, through weird coincidences, through accidentally overhearing a conversation that tells you precisely what you need to know at that moment in time, through omens and the things that pagans love. When we're looking for guidance, it means you're doing the right thing, because the signs are telling you that yes, keep at it. Do A, forget about B, go and do A. A is the right way for you to go. And it's steering you in the direction you need to be going in. To add a flavour that is both Jungian and pagan, more the latter than the former, but a bit of both. It's not just annoying people who come into your life. So for the very, very dry intellectual thinking function type people, who annoys them? All those gushy, emotional water types, those feeling function types, who gush and burst into tears over bugger all, and the thinking function person is left sitting there going, what the hell are you gushing and simpering and gurgling about, you bloody drip? Because they don't value the thinking function. All they see is the negative side of it. They don't see the positive side of it. And until they do see the positive side of it and begin to exhibit and balance the positive side within them, all they will see is the negative, annoying, irritating side of it. And likewise, you can say the same in reverse. Those with a very strong feeling function get really annoyed by thinking people, and likewise the sensation and the intuition functions get annoyed with each other. It's not just people that come into your life and annoy the hell out of you and try to get you to pay attention to the undeveloped, to engage in anantia-dramia. And just to recap that bit in case I didn't make it clear first time, anantia-dramia is what you get when you don't do it with will. When you do it with will, that's not anantia-dramia. Anantia-dramia is life saying, oh, for fuck's sake, get on with it, do this. making you pay attention when you don't want to pay attention. Catholics talk about their holy guardian angel. So if you want to think of it as a guardian spirit that comes along and gives you a good slap and says, get on with it, look, do this. That's an antidramiya when it happens to you rather than being done by you. So not just annoying humans, I will get to the point, but also gods, because gods can be annoying too. Most mythologies have gods within them who are, what's the polite word we have to use about students? These are challenging. You know, the ones you would quite like to push down a flight of stairs. Deities who are known for causing mischief, mayhem, chaos, or on the slightly different tact of having all the subtlety of a bull elephant. That they won't ask you gently to do something. They will boot you from one end of the cosmos to the other. And you'll still have a boot print on your ass 6 months later. Those are the kinds of presences which you could say serve the functions of an antidramiya. That there will be spirit, as pagans we understand that there are spirit presences. Now Jung was thinking of this more in terms of dream imagery and recurrent archetypal presences in life. But going to what I was saying a few minutes ago around archetypes, that it's not just gods are more than archetypes. And so, as I experience it and understand it, and some of you may have totally different experiences, of course, on this front, it's more that the gods who look to your life and understand what's missing, what's undeveloped, what needs working on, gods who are good at building that up will make themselves known in your life in challenging, difficult, awkward ways. Sometimes it may be dreams and nightmares and weird kind of visionary experiences. Sometimes it may be that kind of hair on the back of your neck experience when you're walking through the woods late at night and you think, oh bugger, there's something behind me, isn't there? And you know there's something there and it makes itself very, very known to you. Those of you who have had direct experience will know what I'm talking about. Those of you who haven't, this may sound a little bit weird and off the wall. But these presences will make their way into your life uninvited. You could, I suppose, make the argument that maybe that deep-rooted code, soul code within you is the bit that's done the inviting, perhaps. So not your conscious mind, not your ego that's invited them in, but some much deeper-rooted part of you that knows there's something wrong and is calling out to the cosmos, help me to get balanced. And then presences turn up and pretty much bully you into becoming balanced. In that they'll go on and on and on about it until you finally get it. So it's like having one of those really persistent teachers. If you really hate maths or something, the ones that won't let you off the hook, will go over it and over it and over it until you want to cry and smash your head against the brick wall. And then finally one day you go, oh, that's what you meant. And the penny drops. And the teacher dances on the table, cracks open the champagne, thinks, thank everyone for that. Class over, go away, never darken my doorstep again. And off you go, having learnt that lesson, and you go on to another class. Sometimes the gods can be like that. And not, of course, only gods, but other forms of spirit, being, presences, whatever you want to call them, can take up that sort of function, presence, in your life, making things known, making them balanced. I just check the typed comments. I don't think there's been anything. I don't know if you want me to get more specific than that and start talking about the strengths and weaknesses of all four functions. I've just given you that example of thinking and feeling. If you want me to talk about in more detail sensation and intuition, I can do. But if you are happy with getting the gist of it, then that's equally fine. If I witter on a little bit about some of the other archetypal angles, and then that gives people a chance to type up what they would like to know a bit more about, or indeed what you'd like to know less about if you're fed up hearing certain topics you think I've banged on about them quite enough. and ought to move on to something different. These collective presences, these archetypes, these shared experiences, I could bang on about them for quite a long while. I won't, because it would get really dry, I think, after a while. But a couple worth thinking about. Now, I've done podcasts around the shadow, so I don't want to completely rehash that, because some of you will think, oh God, not all this again. But to touch on it a little bit, and then try to link into other angles and other aspects. Jung said that we have a light side and a dark side. I can't quite do the Darth Vader voice, but you get the gist. The light side is the bit of ourselves that we feel safe, happy to show to the world. The bit of ourselves that's always got positive feedback from people around us. Positive feedback, sometimes that can be in a very bland sort of a way. If you grew up in a very violent environment, then positive might simply mean not getting punched. So it doesn't have to mean hugs and kisses and pats on the head. It can simply be mild encouragement, or at least a lack of overt hostility for some people. For others, it is, who've grown up in a much friendlier environment, it is going to be hugs and kisses and approval and encouragement, and the understanding that people around you as you grow up, they really like it when you behave like this, when you exhibit certain aspects of your personality. That could be when you exhibit your thinking function, or when you exhibit your sensation function, or when you exhibit your intuitive or your feeling function, for example. But it can also be when you exhibit certain qualities that are associated with archetypes. We'll give some examples of those as we go along. The bits of you that go down like a lead balloon become part of the shadow. The bits of you that nobody else likes very much when you're growing up. The bits of you that you're told are rude, dirty, filthy. And I don't just mean mud on your shoes, but morally dirty. Sordid in some way, wrong, malevolent, wicked, sinful. Hundreds of different words that could be used. Those bits of you that other people do not like, you learn to shove into the dark, into the shadow part of yourself, and they coalesce as the unacceptable bits of you. Now that is contextualised because unacceptable to who? Well, unacceptable to the people you're growing up amongst. Might be completely acceptable to some random other person somewhere else in the world, but you don't live with them, so who cares? You live with these people, and this is what they find unacceptable. We have that individually. Jung said we also have it as a culture. Every culture on earth, Swiss culture in his case, American culture, German culture, Chinese culture, Spanish culture, Zimbabwean culture, every culture will have a shadow side to it. Things that are disapproved of by that culture, or episodes from their history that they're embarrassed about or ashamed of, or horrible things they've done in the past that no one talks about anymore. There are a dark side to the culture, and each individual member of that culture, at a very small level, participates in that shadow side. And as well as kind of grim history, it's also things that are just considered generally kind of rude or impolite or not nice within that culture. Things you're not really meant to do. I dare say we could sit and think about what is the British version of that. I'm not quite sure how many 12 people listening at the moment. I'm not quite sure what countries some people may come from other parts of the world, where they'd be thinking about a different culture and the kind of dark shadow side of that. So we have our own individual shadow side, but we also are members of a wider culture, wider community, and that has a shadow side. Just to complicate things even further, subgroups, subcultures have their own shadow side. So as well as speaking as a British person, obviously I'm thinking in terms of the British dark side, the British shadow, as well as that, as a pagan, the pagan subculture, the pagan sub-community, whatever you want to call it, has its dark side. Its own grim histories, things that have happened in the past that were horrible, either done by us or done to us, combination of both, different points in history, and things that are considered not right, not proper, not polite within pagan society, subcultures, that are part of the shadow, part of the dark side. The kinds of things which, if you do, other people will take the piss out of you for, are part of the dark side. Okay, Carol, we'll try and shoehorn a bit of an explanation in as we go along, and then think about some separate, as you say, separate seminar on that alone at some point in the future. So we each have our dark side, and part of being human is to come to terms with your dark side. And you could make the argument, it's a bit of an iffy area to go down, but you could make the argument that maybe some religious traditions are more willing to address and embrace the darkness than others are. Because in some traditions the tendency is to see the darkness as a wicked thing that must be banished and exorcised and driven away, whereas others, and I put various forms of paganism in this category, maybe see darkness as something to try and come to terms with, and see in a more constructive light and a more positive light, and therefore something that people are likely to be more willing, more eager to work with. And so part of the journey of being pagan, that sounds very pretentious, isn't it, is to identify your own dark side. What is it about me that I keep hidden? What do I hide in a box and conceal from others? What am I ashamed of? What am I embarrassed about? What are my capacities for destruction, for cruelty, for hurting people, for causing mayhem? What am I like after 15 gins and the dark side emerges? What is that darkness and how can I come to terms with it? That could be through therapy in the usual sense of the word, the kind of psychological therapy sense of the word, or it may be through ritual, or a bit of both, or just talking to people, informally, not to a therapist, I mean, but chatting to friends, etc. But ritual certainly can be used as a way of approaching your own dark side, to understand that grim history, and to try to come to some sort of understanding with it. Jung, building on Freud's arguments around the id, says that the longer you keep it repressed, all this darkness bottled up and shoved down, the weirder it will get, the nastier it will get, it'll fester. And what it really needs is to be embraced, to flow out. It won't necessarily become all lovely and smashing when it flows out, it might still be quite grim, but it will be something that you're then more in charge of rather than subject to. Because whilst it's repressed, it's like a monster locked in the cellar that keeps kicking and banging on the door, and everyone upstairs is terrified of it. Whenever the door rattles, everyone gets into a panic. You are living in fear of something. And therefore if you live in fear of something, you are, to a point, servile to it, subject to its whims, its bad moods, its strops. It's tyranny. Whereas if you can confront the darkness, come to terms with it, accept it, understand it, no longer need to keep it locked in the cellar, then that reign of fear reaches an end and it becomes more of a positive experience, more of a constructive experience. And as far as Jung is concerned, that also liberates this huge pool of energy. Freud talked about libido. No, and these days people think of libido as a purely sexual thing, but when Freud used it, it was a kind of an energy source. Your oomph, your drive, your energy, your passion for life, and that gets bottled up by locking it in the dark. So bringing it out gives you these tremendous reserves of energy you perhaps had forgotten wherever they are in the first place. And so that becomes a form of healing, form of rejuvenation. And one of the advantages, I think, within paganism is that we have seasonal rituals, seasonal festivals. Lots of other religions do, of course, as well. But we have seasons for the sun and summer and spring and light and bright and jolly. But we also have seasons and festivals and rituals around darkness and winter. Obviously, it does depend on which bit of the world you live in. Some parts of the world don't really have a winter as such, but they have other, like ancient Egypt has the seasons so hot everything shrivels and dies, as opposed to Britain, the season so cold everything shrivels and dies. But the underlying concept is the same, the season of death, if you like. And so by having an embrace of those seasons, not only is it a chance to think about the external world and plants and animals and the weather and nature and farming and the rest of it, but a chance to think about your own interior darkness, your own interior winter, your own interior pains that you have never come to terms with, griefs and losses and repressed rage and fears and dreads and all the kinds of things that get bottled up, in most people at least, and pushed into the darkness. Those rituals on an annual basis help to provide a structure, which we can. Obviously, you could opt not to, but I think it's constructive to use those festivals to think about yourself in that way and seek, not just think something, oh well, I've thought about it now, right, next, but to actually try to delve into that darkness. And that's where you get perhaps myths. A very famous one is the myth of the goddess Inanna from Sumerian culture, who journeys into the underworld when her husband Tammuz dies. And his soul goes into the underworld, and Inanna descends into the underworld to try and bring his soul back. Similar stories told in other parts of the world about other deities. As she goes down into the underworld, she has to strip away she's wearing kind of layers of clothing, layers of sort of silks and things, and she has to strip them away at each of the 7 doors. So by the time she goes to the final door, she's got nothing on. She's naked. That's a stripping away of the veils we hide behind, in a sense, until it's just the raw you with no hiding, not from other people, because what they know or don't know is irrelevant, but you are no longer hiding from yourself. You are no longer veiling your own sight of yourself. And on the other side of that last gateway, she meets her sister, Ereshkigal, who is queen of the underworld, and a very kind of grim character. For those of you old enough to remember kind of, was it Dallas and Dynasty and all those dreadful soap operas, American soap operas from the 80s, imagine Ereshkigal as a kind of a bit of a vindictive Joan Collins type of a character, scheming and feuding and vengeful and filled with pain and lashing out at other people. When Inanna is naked with no more veils, she sees that raw pain, that bleeding wound that is her sister, and must come to terms in order to make a bargain for her beloved to return to the land of the living. Whether even if you've got no interest in Sumerian mythology, you can find similar stories in quite a lot of cultures. That notion of confronting that raw bleeding pain at the heart and gradually trying to heal it. That's not something you can do in one simple ritual. That's years and years and years and years of slogging away at it, but gradually healing it, and little by little the wounds recover, get better. The darkness may always be there, will always be there, because there's always winter, there's always night, it doesn't go away. But the repression doesn't need to be there. And so there is that sense of, for Jung, mythology is, to a point at least, a psychodrama, an understanding of how different aspects of the human psyche relate to each other. And so the thing to understand is that in the story of Inanna and Ereshkigal and Tammuz and so on, you might, at the start of the story, identify with Inanna, because she's the heroine figure, the central character of the story. But actually, by the time you get to the end of the story, you realise that yes, you're Inanna, but you are also Ereshkigal. You are also Tammuz, you are also the other characters. You're all of them. They are all you. But different parts of you, different aspects of you. And it's part of that. And so I think personally there is more to myth than only psychodrama. It's limiting if you look at myth as being only serving one function, which is the limitation I think of people like Joseph Campbell and Levi Strauss and so on, is that they tend to have a hobby horse and ride it and then forget about everything else. Myth is multifunctional, it does 20 different things at the same time, of which psychodrama is one. But a very important aspect. The danger is, I think, that ritual and mythology can easily be hijacked and turned into nothing but a glorified form of therapy for the narcissistic, who want to bang on and on and on about themselves all the bloody time. The ultimate goal of going within is that you come back again. You go into the underworld, but then you come out and you become a force of goodness and use to the world above. It's not all just sitting in front of a mirror and going, tell me about me, aren't I interested? And spending the rest of eternity doing that. It's to heal in order to become better as you go back into the world, to return whole and bring what you find in the dark back out. Rescue the treasures from the dragon, or whatever metaphor you want to use, and bring back out to the world. And so you can have ritual that is focused on psychodrama, but also to bear in mind it's equally about changing seasons in nature. It's about communicating with deities who are real beings, at least that's the way I interpret them, who are more than the sum of their archetypal parts. So it's all of those things simultaneously, and better not get so bogged down in one approach you forget about the other approaches. Otherwise, again, imbalance tends to kick in and it becomes problematic. There are other angles we could talk about for time. For example, one of the ones I jotted down when we did a paper that I don't think I've spoken about in any other podcast, so it's a bit of a new flavour, is the pure eternus, the eternal child. There is a Welsh story of Mabon, and King Arthur is charged with having to rescue Mabon. Mabon is a young boy, who has been abducted, whisked away, and his mother, Modron, desperately wants him back. And so King Arthur and his band of loyal adventurers go on an adventure, on a journey, to try and rescue Mabon. And no one knows where he is. That's half the problem. So they talk to various ancient animals, and each animal is ridiculously old. And they say to one animal, have you seen Mabon? And that animal goes, oh, well, no, actually. But however, if you go and talk to that other animal over there who is 10 times older than I am, they might have seen Mabon. And on and on, it goes on like that for a while. So animal to animal to animal to animal. And by the time they eventually find Mabon, you realise he must be, even though he's an eternal child, he's a child, he must be hundreds of thousands of years old, because he's older than all of the animals. Because only the very, 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 very oldest animal, the Salmon of Wisdom, actually remembers who Mabon is or where he is. So, although he's incredibly old, he remains a child, never grows up, and is this eternal child presence. Jung argued that we have this inner child, an innocence within ourselves, which never ages, never decays, never gets wrinkly, remains always youthful and vital. Even when you're 95 years old, it remains youthful and vital. And it's been a popular topic with a lot of kind of self-help books and therapy books and so on, this idea of getting in touch with your inner child, this creative spark within. And that by doing so you can find your innocence, your freedom, your joy, and chuck off the shackles of drudgery and paying taxes and phone bills and gas bills and all this boring old codswallop that we drown life in. Going back to another sociologist, Max Weber, back in the late 19th century, argued that the Industrial Revolution had caused not only mass migrations from the countryside to the cities where the factories were, but caused life to become very bureaucratic, because if you're running a massive factory, then you need to account for every nut and bolt and who does what, where, when, how, and all the rest of it. And it all be just managing a vast number of people working for a corporation involves a lot of paperwork and a lot of minutiae, and the bureaucracy gets heavier and heavier and heavier in order to manage, and then people, rather than the bureaucracy serving the people, it ends up with the people serving the bureaucracy. And paperwork for the sake of paperwork. And that innocence, that joy, that childlike quality, that magic of self and life is lost, thrown away in this dreary, bureaucratic, workaday, boring arsehole world that we have created for ourselves. And each one of us participates in and sustains. Being a German speaker, Weber referred to it as Entzauberung, the breaking of the enchantment, the breaking of the spell. He imagined the world pre-Industrial Revolution. He wasn't old enough to remember the world pre-Industrial Revolution, but he imagined it as this place in which people had a sense of wonder. That they'd go walking in the woods for a picnic or something or other, and they'd feel the dryads in the trees and the pixies in the fields, and the gods and the angels and the demons and the ghosts, and what they lived in a world of presence, of wonder, of magic, of enchantment. But as industry and bureaucracy and clock watching and paperwork and everything being dry and drab and boring and manageable and orderly became the new norm, all of that, he says, was lost. And so even though Max Weber wasn't, by any stretch of imagination, wasn't a Jungian, because Jung didn't exist when Max Weber was alive, but he probably would have really struggled with Jung's writings had he been gifted with a crystal ball and able to read them. But nonetheless, what he describes as that sense of wonderment, that magical spark of the beauty of life, is pretty much what Jung is talking about with the pure eternus, the eternal wonder of the child. So the kid who can wander in the country lanes and spend 10 minutes staring at a flower because it's beautiful, or watch a butterfly crawling up a plant and get into the nectar, and just be awed by it, not pull its wings off or stamp on it and go, oh God, this is boring, let me throw it on, but rather be enchanted by it, enraptured by it. That's what the pure eternus is. That's what Max Weber felt had been lost from life in the soulless exhaustion of working back-breaking shifts and being a kind of a wage slave in the factories, rather like Bakunin imagined. Well, he pretty much described the reality thereof. You've got people like Maurice Berman in recent times, who noted the vast increase of Prozac prescriptions. They've gone up thousands and thousands and thousands of percent in the space of a few years, and argued that maybe we have created a life so dreary that the only way to get through it is drugged up to your eyeballs, because we've lost that sense of wonderment, that sense of awe. Not everyone agrees with him, obviously. A lot of people think he's just wearing rosy spectacles and life has always been a bit shit. And that maybe medication actually helps. But Berman called for the re-enchantment of life, a kind of a return to a sense of awe and wonderment at simple beauties. You do get people who are very enamoured of technology who will say that isn't a laptop or a mobile phone a thing of wonder. And of course, at one level, yes, it is a thing of scientific wonder, and it's amazing how they do what they do. It's beyond my brain cells' capacity to comprehend. But whether he's an old romantic or whether you agree with him, Berman has this sense that the wonder you can get from the butterfly or the seashell or the listening to the sound of the wind in the branches of the trees, that sense of wonder is better than the wonder you will get from staring at a screen and going blip, 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 blip on your apps. You might agree, you might think he's just old-fashioned, I don't know. But it's, as an argument, it's something that obviously has a certain resonance within paganism. That awe, that wonder, to get in touch with that pure eternus, that internal child, the kid you once were, and to find the sense of awe and specialness and magic, and to be lost in a story, to be the audience in storytelling, to sit and listen, and your imagination is soaring and you're seeing the gods and the dragons and the monsters and the heroes and the heroines, and it's alive in your mind. That sense of joy is what makes storytelling, and it makes ritual, and it makes psychodrama alive. It gives you the capacity to suspend disbelief, to forget about the bills and the shopping you've got to do tomorrow and that pile of essays you've got to mark and all the rest of it. To leave that behind for a period of time and enter into a world of magic. And how does magic happen? Well, from a Jungian point of view, you could argue that opening up the pure eternus is step number one to allowing something transcendent and wonderful to occur. Another angle to think about, archetypal angle, is the argument that Jung puts out that we all have either an inner man or an inner woman. So men have an inner woman and women have an inner man, which is an archetype of what the other sex is like, imprinted on you, again inherited from all of the hundred generations of past experience as we tap into the collective unconscious and the shared culture. How should men behave, how should women behave, etc. For straight people, heterosexuals, that there is a sexual frisson in that for the straight man, his inner woman is his ideal romantic label, his ideal sexual partner, his ideal wife, girlfriend. For the straight woman, her inner man is her ideal husband, her ideal boyfriend, her kind of fantasy figure, as it were. It gets a bit more complicated when you get onto gay people and bisexuals and asexuals and what have you. But we can perhaps temporarily put that to one side and stick with the easier explanation for the moment. At any rate, that's what you're searching for. But what Jung emphasises is that whilst it will drive your sexual urges when you're young, 20s and 30s and so on, you'll be looking for that perfect woman or perfect man. Ultimately, what you need to do is concentrate on finding within the traits. So by all means, he's not saying don't get married, don't get laid, don't have a sex life. He's not saying that at all. But what he is saying is that no physical man will live up to your inner man, to the standards of him. No physical woman will live up to the standards of your inner woman. So the inner woman is the anima, and the inner man is the animus, which is just the masculine and feminine terms for the same words in Latin. So the woman searching for her animus, if she expects her boyfriend, any boyfriend, no matter who the hell he is, to be able to live up to the image she has up here, she will be disappointed and he will have a very unhappy life trying to please someone he can't please. And vice versa for the man searching for his anima, his ideal inner woman. That physical human being you fall in love with may remind you of bits of your anima or your animus. But they're a real person. They're not this internal archetype. They are more than an archetype. Not less than, more than an archetype. And so to truly love them, you must love them as they are, rather than getting disappointed because they don't live up to your fantasy that you had of them at the start. Because your fantasy is not really of them. Your fantasy is actually this part of you up here, this inner part, this soul part, your inner man or your inner woman. And it's not even really a man or a woman, ultimately. It's that inner half of you, that undeveloped part of you, that represents masculine traits or feminine traits that are within you. The argument being that if you're a man, you will be encouraged by society to put your masculine traits first and leave your feminine traits in the background. Not quite in the shadow as such, but sort of getting there in the background. And equally, if you're born a woman, society will encourage you to develop your feminine traits and leave your masculine traits in the background, by whatever standard your culture considers masculine and feminine. Because clearly, if you're living in 10th century China, you're probably going to have very different ideas of masculine and feminine than someone who is living in 21st century California will have of masculine and feminine. So it's as defined by the culture you grew up in. Part of you is in the background, and we're back to this soul code calling, this yearning, this deep up here bit of you. If you want to be all chakric, it's up here. Calling for you to achieve balance. And balance comes in here, by attaining balance in yourself, not by external balance with another flesh and blood human being. So the goal is for the man to develop his feminine traits, and for the woman to develop her masculine traits, until they are in balance in themselves. And that balance, that harmony, he refers to as Suzuki. It's another of the high-tech props. Suzuki is to achieve balance between not just the male and the female, but all of the various different kind of inner conflicts, developed bits and undeveloped bits, to try and attain some sense of harmony and balance between these. And it's a remarkably difficult thing to do, Jung said, under the age of 40. In fact, why even bloody bother? Because under the age of 40, you're busy acquiring life experience. After the age of 40, then, you've got the chance to slow down a bit, I wish, and reflect on these parts of yourself and develop them and find that true harmony. It doesn't guarantee, just because you're 40, 50, 60, 70, doesn't guarantee you'll get it. Most people might not get it, and yet Lord knows what percentage of people go to their graves never having attained any sense of internal balance. But that, Jung said, is the goal of the truly mature soul, the harmonious being. And again, it doesn't matter if you're pagan, Jewish, Hindu, atheist, Buddhist, what the hell you are, that you are striving towards, or at least your soul is striving to push you towards, attaining balance, where repressed parts of yourself are developed to a similar level to the developed parts of yourself. You become a rounded being. And that doesn't mean you fall out of love with your husband or wife or whoever, but you are then, it's much actually more likely to have a happy relationship after Suzuki than before Suzuki. Because after Suzuki, you can see your beloved as a real human being, as a whole person in their own right, rather than treating them as a projector screen on which to push your own dreams and hopes and fantasies and urges. So you see them for who they are, rather than for who you wish they were. And I suppose you might see them as who they are and think, oh my God, what a nightmare. But hopefully you will see them as who they are and love them for who they are. And then you have a real love rather than kind of a fantasy-based, delusional sort of a love, an attachment for that person. I'll just check to see if there's any more messages typed up. I keep forgetting to put this in. No, okay. So if we move from there on to the idea of alchemy, because Jung was fascinated by alchemy. Now, alchemy per se is not a part of paganism. It developed in the Judeo-Christian tradition of ceremonial magic, but it has its roots in much earlier concepts and ideas. And so I think some elements of this do actually fit quite well with pagan concepts. Jung said there are 4 stages well, I say Jung said this, he was taking ideas from medieval alchemy and giving them a psychological spin. In medieval alchemy, the books are written with the suggestion that these are procedures in chemistry. Things you can do, burn this, then dissolve it in that chemical and mix it with that chemical, and then this will happen and that will happen. So it's presented as a chemistry lesson, but not the kind of chemistry that 21st century chemists would recognise as valid. Jung's argument, and not just him, loads of other people made the same argument, is that if you take these medieval alchemy books literally as chemistry lessons, you're going to make a mistake. They're not meant, he says, to be chemistry lessons. They are meant to be spiritual lessons. The chemistry is a metaphor for something else, something more mystical. So when he talks about alchemy, he's talking about it as a metaphor for something psychological rather than as actual mix a test tube of this substance with a test tube of that substance. Now he says they're building on the teachings of the medieval books. There are 4 stages to go through. The first is nigredo, the blackening stage, which in the medieval books is where you incinerate things, you reduce them to ashes, burn them up. Hence nigredo from the Latin word for black. So you burn these things up and reduce them to ash. What does that mean at a metaphorical level? Well, for Jung, that's where you confront your shadow. That's the stage, the first stage towards wisdom, is sit down, turn the lights off, blow the candles out, sit in darkness, face your own darkness. And you could take that very literally, if you're doing a ritual, to actually blow the candles out, to sit in darkness, with no more light than you might get from the moon or the stars. And in that darkness, and certainly if, for those of you who have sat in a wood at night times, or a field, or a seashore, or wherever at night time, it can get a bit freaky, a bit spooky, because all those evolutionary parts of your brain that have been there for umpty million years go, oh my god, there's things in the dark, it's going to eat me. So it sets off all your inner anxieties and fears. It's a freaky experience. And that's the point. It's to come to some kind of balance, some kind of context with fear, with terror. Both the fear of lions and tigers that might eat you in the night, if you're living in that part of the world, and those parts of the world, because lions and tigers don't live in the same parts of the world, and fear of the darkness inside you. So not just the scary monsters and big animals and things that might bite your ass in the darkness, but the darkness in you, which could be a lot of different things. It depends on the person, of course. It could be your capacity to be hateful and spiteful and vindictive and nasty. It could be your capacity to be jealous and possessive and destructive. It could be your capacity for invidia, to want to destroy what other people have got because you're consumed with envy for them. It could be loneliness, fear of death and illness and old age and pain. It could be resentment at what someone did to you 20, 30, 40 years ago. It could be a million and one horrible, horrible memories of gruesome, bloody things that have happened to you in the past that you've not come to terms with. There could be all sorts of things that might be sitting in the darkness. But to come to terms with that darkness, to have your dark night of the soul, where you sit and you scream and you gibber and you pee yourself and you think, oh my, that's worthless, I'm going to jump off a bridge. But you don't go and jump off a bridge. You burn through it. And that's where we get back to that alchemical thing of burning. It's burning away the dross, burning away the negativity. We could, how are we doing for time? Okay. Flag up, go a little bit Jewish for 5 minutes, and flag up an idea from within Kabbalism. Kabbalism, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, is a school of magic in Judaism. Kabbalism, the central teaching of it is that the tree of life, the Kabbalah, is an arrangement, a diagram, which shows ultimately how the universe was created by God, in the Jewish understanding of God. Created in different stages, coming down and eventually ending with the physical world, well, trees and rocks and mountains and chairs and tables, this way, but coming down through a succession of layers of creation. Part of that teaching within Kabbalism is that there are these 10 stages of creation. We're the bottom one. At each stage, as the force of divinity, the force of God, went from stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, at each stage there were acts of creation. Great, wonderful, amazing, beautiful, fabulous things brought into existence. But in an act of creation, there is waste product, byproduct. One image that I've seen used in different books is the idea of smelting metal. You get metal ore and you smelt it down, and eventually you end up with a sword or a knife or a plowshare or whatever it is you're making. But in the process of smelting the metal down to make your amazing thing, there is runoff, detritus, there is the slag from the metal, the gunk that you chuck away. That gunk, in the Kabbalistic understanding, is the tree of death, the Qliphoth. And just as there are these 10 spheres of beautiful creation, so there are 10 spheres of dross, of rubbish, of runoff, of detritus. And it's kind of like evil is a bit of an unfortunate word to use because it's not quite what it's getting at. But it's this tree of darkness, this tree of death, this tree of waste. And so darkness and waste and the dross is integral to creation. You can't have the one without the other. So the being that creates the good things is also the being that creates, by default, the bad things. If light falls upon you, it casts a shadow behind you. So you cannot have the light without the shadow. The shadow is a byproduct of the light falling. And so nigredo, the darkness, the burning off, is the burning off of the dross, the suffering, none of which would exist if you had not been created in the first place. The very act of creating you as the person you are today has left a path of dross. It's a nice image, isn't it? A path of dreck behind you. And you have to come to terms with that darkness, that crap, that misery and suffering and disappointment and unhappiness and all of that shite. You've got to come to terms with it in order to move beyond it. And until you do, you'll never move beyond. So the first stage of this journey to spirituality, of spiritual wholeness, of attainment, of fulfillment, is the darkness, coming to terms with the darkness. So you begin in night. And you can put that in very pagan terms, that for Druids and Celtic Wiccans and what have you, the year starts at Samhain, at the beginning of winter. It starts in darkness. Because the life of the baby, for mammals at any rate, starts in the womb, in the darkness of the womb. The child is in darkness before they see light. The seed is in the darkness of the earth before it grows up into a shoot and sees the light. So all things, from that perspective, begin in darkness. And then they emerge. So the next stage, the second stage, is albedo, which is from the Latin word for white. That's the whitening, the white stage. This is absolutely nothing to do with racial politics, before anyone gets their knickers in a twist on that one. The albedo, the whitening stage, there's again various chemistry images used in the medieval texts, but the way Jung interprets this is partly it's a cleansing, so you've burnt off all of the suffering, and now it's a sort of cleaning house and putting things in order. But it's also the period in which you come to terms with your anima, if you're a man, or your animus, if you're a woman. You meet that inner self. You find it, you balance it, you embrace it, you accept it, you recognise that it is you. It's not your wife, it's not your husband, it's not your boyfriend, it's not your girlfriend, it's not some Hollywood starlet that you're lusting after. It is you. You have these feminine traits if you're a man, you have these masculine traits if you're a woman. And so you develop them, you balance them between your primary traits that you've learned over donkey's years of your life to have as your main public focus, going back to that Goffman front stage, backstage idea. That's your public self. And then you have your background stage, the bits of you that haven't got much development and have never seen the light of day very often. Those traits you try to bring to the fore and you achieve in a harmony. So you stop trying to find someone else to be those things for you, because you are now being those things yourself. Now that doesn't mean you can't appreciate when somebody else, a lover, husband, wife, friend, whoever, does nice things for you. Of course you can appreciate that, anyone would. But you're not reliant on them to be those things for you, because you know how to be those things for yourself. Again, as we were saying earlier, what is constituted as masculine traits or feminine traits? Jung has his own ideas on this, but we can be a bit more 21st century and say that whatever it is in your culture that you grew up in, whatever that culture says is masculine, that's the masculine side, and whatever that culture says is feminine is the feminine side. Somebody from a different part of the world might have different views on that. That's fine, that doesn't matter. It's not trying to achieve one standard for the whole of humanity. It's saying that this is how you have understood these qualities in the society in which you grew up. This is how it's operating in you. There you go. Achieve balance between the bits you've been encouraged to exhibit and the bits you've been discouraged from exhibiting, in order to achieve this albedo stage, this balancing. If anyone's got any questions about all this in the waffle, do type them in the comment section, because otherwise I'll just prattle on forever and I may be telling you things you already know or couldn't care less about, or ignoring things you do want to know about perhaps. So the third stage is citrinitas, which sounds like some dodgy quango agency that gets government funding and backhanders. But citrinitas is the yellowing stage, from citrine, yellow, in Latin. So citrinitas, you've in the first stage in Negredo you confronted your shadow. In the second stage, albedo, you confronted your anima or animus, as the case may be. And so in citrinitas, there's another. Confrontation is not quite the right word because it sounds hostile, doesn't it? It's not really meant to sound hostile. You meet with, that's better than confront. You meet with your darkness. You meet with your flip gender side, your male or female side, as the case may be. And in citrinitas, you meet with your wise old man or wise old woman, depending on what your gender is. So that part of you, which is your wise self, your sage self, and this is another of the archetypes. So just as you've had the archetypal man and the archetypal woman, you've had the shadow as an archetype of darkness. So culture after culture after culture, you find stories, mythologies, novels, films, stage plays, radio plays, and the rest of it, which have the image of a wizard or of a witch, a wise old person who comes along, and if it's a man, big white beard, and a woman, slightly shorter beard, comes along and embodies knowledge and wisdom and kindness, and if there's a younger hero or heroine, it's the wise old what's-it who gives them advice on how to tackle their problems in life. Tons of fairy tales like that, and you can think of characters in popular fiction like Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars films. Doctor Who is an example of the sage, the wise old man. You've got what's his face, Dumbledore in the Harry Potter books, and Maggie Smith's character, McGonagall, Professor McGonagall. So wise old man, wise old woman characters in lots and lots of stories and novels, a recurrent image, a recurrent archetype. So even when you're very young, you have a part of you that is learning and absorbing the wisdom from the collective unconscious that's been laid down by hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of generations of people going back to the year zero. And as I was arguing earlier, I'd add not just human persons, but other beings too that are capable of wisdom that we have the capacity to tap into. So there's that part of you that is wise and admirable, sometimes cantankerous and stroppy when you don't follow the wisdom. If you've ever given advice to someone who completely ignores it, you can understand why you get stroppy and cantankerous. But that higher self, wiser self, the guardian angel concept, which is there as your protector, guide, steerer, advisor, crops up in dreams and so on. And there are deities that partake of that archetype. There's the wise old what's it like Ogma in Irish myth, or the Cailleach is a kind of a scary wise old woman image. She's the wilds of the mountain. So you have these gods and goddesses that partake of that archetype, although they are more than just that bit, but partake of it. So it is tuning into that wise part of yourself, that capacity for knowledge that's always been there, that capacity for understanding. And I would suggest a key to this, and I'm not sure if I'm conflating gendered knowledge, which is a dodgy area to go down these days because people scream and shout a lot about things like this. I would say emotional wisdom, emotional intelligence, understanding, is a significantly large part of this. So it's not only knowledge as in kind of having read a million books and knowing all there is to know about astronomy or something or another of that nature, but it is primarily knowing people, understanding other people, and not only human people, but understanding, being able to emotionally read your dog, being able to emotionally read a horse, being able to emotionally read the spirits that live at the end of the garden, to understand people. Now, at one point in time, that would have been regarded as a very feminine thing, the wise old woman rather than the wise old man. And for a lot of people, that may still be that the wise old man has one type of knowledge and the wise old woman another type of knowledge. Whereas I'm kind of reading this as more unisex, but maybe that's me being all very 21st century and talking shite, I don't know. Historically, I think it has been more gendered than I'm currently thinking of it as being at the moment. But anyway, it's tapping into that wisdom. Now, one of the phrases found in quite a few alchemy books talks about the yellowing of the lunar conscience. So the lunar conscience is albedo, the moon glow, the white glow of the moon, where you're coming to terms with your inner man or your inner woman. The dream self, the kind of the man or woman you dream about at night, sort of thing. And the yellowing, citrinitas, the yellow, the goldening, the yellowing. And alchemy is about turning lead into gold, so that when it talks about the yellowing of, it's talking about becoming like gold. So the yellowing of is bringing lunar consciousness into solar consciousness. The yellow. That you can certainly understand from a pagan point of view, especially within Wicca, but also in a number of other pagan traditions. The idea of lunar thinking, the kind of thoughts of the night, of the moon, feminine thoughts, goddess ways of approaching life, and solar, more masculine, more god forces within Wicca. But obviously other types of paganism would categorise that in a very different light. But that's you can understand it in that light, perhaps, in that respect, in that regard. So the yellowing is adding a layer of wisdom. And to a point, the archetype of the wise old man is part of the animus, and the archetype of the wise old woman is part of the anima. So this is an extension of, but it's more of a kind of a non-sexualized, so it's not a romantic figure, a sex fantasy figure, it's more of a guardian, protective parental, grandparental figure that looks after the vulnerability of the soul, the emergent soul, which is like the pure eternus, as it's emerging as a newborn in a sense. And finally, we get on to rubedo. The reddening comes from the Latin word for red. The reddening phase. And in the reddening phase, you're achieving syzygy. So going back to that again. So here, syzygy is not just the balancing of the male and the female, it's the balancing of everything that has been repressed, neglected, hidden away, forgotten about, with the things that have been remembered, focused on, developed, strengthened. So the weak comes up to meet the strong, and then both sides are strong. And there is no longer a weak side, there is no longer a side that's neglected or shoved down. Both are up here. It's the bringing up, so that they both, or bringing up like that, so that they both meet there, and they're both equally strong and equally rounded and developed and balanced and wholesome. And it's that movement forward. So rubedo is the final stage, is that sense of achievement and of rebirth. And I suppose you could, if you want to put it again into more perhaps pagan terms, less chemical terms, the red, the reddening, the rubedo is the blood of new birth. So that the emergence into a new life with the blood from giving birth, at least for mammals at any rate, and the coming out, the emergence of new life, of a new phase, of a new stage, becoming the new self, the new you. A number of pagan traditions have processes of initiation, where you go through learning periods and study and train and develop knowledge and skills and learn not only skills but also learn about yourself, and you want to balance yourself and so on. And at the end of it, you're reborn in a ritual and you take on board a new name, and that becomes your ritual name that you're known by amongst your fellow pagans. And that's if it's done in line with Jungian teachings in a sense, that is the rubedo, the birth of the new you, fresh to a new path. And this is the rounded you, the balanced you, the wholesome you, the one that's no longer imbalanced and kind of on the wonk, but is now walking in a balanced way, moving forward in life as this new sense of who you are. Moving on with that, I don't know, I might be a little bit earlier than the 5 on this, I'll see how it goes. But moving on from that, one of the ideas I want to dance around is the sense of creation and creativity. There's a concept in alchemy, the image of Mercurius, linked to Mercury, both the Roman god Mercury, Mercurius, but also to the chemical substance of Mercury, and astrologically to the planet Mercury. So a kind of interweaving of concepts and ideas there. Mercurius is understood as a demiurge. Demiurge. Which is an idea you can find in ancient Greece and a number of other ancient cultures as well. The demiurge is the creative principle of the universe, the kind of the being that makes the universe, like that giant in the air in a sense, the being that becomes part of the universe, and in the process becomes part of their own creation. Now, the act of creation is a sort of dynamic, engaging, flowing experience, but it can also be a trapping experience, so simultaneously good and bad, positive and negative at the same time, as all things are. Everything in life can have both positives to it, and negatives to it simultaneously. It's the way of the world. I don't want to get bogged down in abstract, airy-fairy theological notions because it gets a bit weird. So let's put this in more human terms. Let's say you're a painter. You create a painting. You're splashing away at your canvas, You're investing yourself in that canvas, and when it's hung on the wall, there is you are in it. Part of you is in it. Your mind, your imagination, your ideas, and probably your sweat dripping on the canvas. Physically, you are in that painting. Maybe you sell the painting or give it to someone or put it in the gallery or whatever you're going to do with it. So even when somebody else has bought it and owned it and it is theirs, hanging up on their wall, you are in it. Now, for some artists, they can experience this problem of never being quite happy with their art. And they finish the painting, and then they look at it and think, oh, if I'd done this a little different, if I'd done that a little different, and they want to go back and fiddle with the frigging thing, and it's never, in their mind, it's never done. Because even when they think it's done, a week later they change their mind and want to alter it. So they're immersed in their art even when they've let go of their art. Novelists write their books and they're out there in the world, and afterwards they're thinking, oh, why didn't I say this? Oh, if only I changed that sentence and said it this way instead of that way. So even when it's over, it's done with, it's gone, they're involved with it. And it can become, for some people, quite a negative experience. So like Arthur Conan Doyle, when he created Sherlock Holmes and made himself a fortune writing about Sherlock Holmes, years down the line got sick to fucking death of Sherlock Holmes. Got so fed up writing about him, he wanted to write other stuff. But the book buying public kept saying, oh, we don't want your other stuff, we're not interested very much in that. What we want is more Sherlock Holmes. And the publishers, who just want money, were saying, oh yes, more Sherlock Holmes, more Sherlock Holmes. Stop wasting your time writing this other codswallop, write Sherlock Holmes. And so he wrote The Reichenbach Falls and tried to kill off Sherlock Holmes, and that was such an unpopular move that he ended up having to bring him back from the dead. And likewise, Agatha Christie got fed up writing about Hercule Poirot, even though he'd made her an absolute fortune of money from doing it. She wanted to do other stuff, but the public wanted Poirot. And some of her books, it's very obvious that she kind of shoehorned Poirot into it at the last minute because her publishers made her. And actually, she wanted the book to be about somebody else. Different character entirely. For some people, they can become trapped by their own creative success. They get so good at doing a thing that people around them want more and more and more of that thing, and they'd like to go and try something different, branch off into other areas, but the consuming public don't want it. And so there is a sense in which people can become trapped in their own creativity. So not just in the sense of your imagination, your mind is in the thing you've created, invented, but feeling that you're almost then defined by, restricted by the thing you have created, and it becomes difficult to create anything else that's different afterwards, because there is a clamour for you to do that. Now that's not only in terms of really famous authors and musicians and whatnot, but even at a much more humble level, you can become known for doing certain things. And the person who's really good at cooking certain dishes, and everyone wants to eat that dish all the time, and they're bored to bloody death of cooking it, but that's what people want. They'd like to do something else, but no, people want that. Or someone who's really, really good at teaching geography, and they're so good at it that they keep getting hired to do more and more geography lessons, and they think, I've taught this lesson so often, I can do it in my bloody sleep. I'd like to do something different, but no, do this all the time. And they become trapped in the thing that they're good at. You could, by extension, argue most lives involve some degree of creativity, and there is always that danger that the creativity defines you. So we're back to that idea of worthship, that we are defined by the things that shaped, defined by the things we give worth to, and they we shape them and they shape us, that two-way street again. Everything is always two-way interactive. And it's understanding that you become part of the things you create, and the things you create become part of you, become a definer of you. And the struggle for Jung and other thinkers in this area is that the demiurge, the creative spirit, the curious, is endlessly creative, wants to create 1,000,000,000 different things, but becomes trapped in a certain way of life. And we create for ourselves a way of life. You earn a certain amount of money, you use that money to buy whatever food it is that you want, or at least you can afford, and rent a house or buy a house or do whatever it is you're going to do. You create a lifestyle that then perpetuates itself. And it's very difficult to break out of that lifestyle and do something totally different. So not just creativity in the sense of music and paintings and embroidery and things like that, but other forms of creativity as well, of wanting the life you create for yourself to be either freeing or entrapping. Right, you don't want it to be entrapping, but you set out to create something that is positive. And you end up with something that can become binding and trap you within its own remits and becomes difficult to move beyond. And there's always this tension between wanting to branch out into the new and becoming trapped in the old. And this cycle of nigredo and albedo and citrinitas and rubedo, it's not just a thing you do once and it's over and done with and that's your life, boom, you're sorted, you're off, you're laughing. Rather, it's an ongoing cycle, an ongoing pattern, where you can reach a certain point that you've got to that nigredo, you've created your new life, your new sense of self, you're balanced, and 10, 20, 30 years down the line, depending on your age, you've created a new life, a new way of being, and that has become entrapping, and you started to unbalance again. Because achieving balance is not like it's you fix in amber. You don't kind of go, oh, I'm balanced now, right, that's me sorted forever. You're balanced now, maybe 10 years down the line, life goes on, new demands, things happen in the world like COVID and all this crap. Things happen that can tilt you out of balance after you've achieved balance. So this isn't quite like that Buddhist idea of sitting under a tree and finding enlightenment and boom, that's you translated into a higher sphere. It's an ongoing dynamic process. It's a flexible process that you can go into, but sometimes also come out of, and then have to re-begin, start that journey again, and go back into a new wave of nigredo and albedo and all the rest of it, and ongoing. So it's a cycle of nature, like the cycle of spring and summer and winter and so on, that you get out of winter and into spring and you're rejoicing, but you know winter will come again eventually. So you're not perpetually out of it. You're out of it for now, but these things will happen again in the future. So it's an ongoing cycle. It's an ongoing process that flows in and out. And to some extent, it goes with a concept that Jung puts out there of what he refers to as participation mystique, where he's exploring ideas from within anthropology, to point it out, and combining it with notions of psychology. And he's talking about fetish. Now that's fetish in the anthropological sense, not in the sexual sense of whips and chains and high-heeled shoes and all of that. But fetish, a sacred object that is believed to have power and magical property by the people who revere it, like a totem pole or a shaman's drum or what have you. And paganism makes, in its various different forms and varieties, makes a lot of use of ritual objects that are imbued with magical power and spirit and presence and energy. And for animists, taking that word animus in a somewhat different context, all things have spirit, or can come at least in time to have spirit. And so certain objects can acquire their own life. Now, from Jung's perspective, this is more a projection of the human imagination into something else, rather than an innate quality of the object. Whereas from an animist perspective, or most forms of paganism are basically animism, to some extent at any rate. Most pagans, and I certainly would argue that it's not a flight of fantasy or an imagination of the individual, rather it's a recognition of what is actually there. That object, that item, that thing has its own mystique, has its own animus, its own spirit, its own presence. This is the recognition of it by a human being, who is then communicating with, engaging with, interacting with, harnessing the presences in that magical or mysterious place or object or whatever the thing may be. If it's a recognition of a pre-existing spirit, that's one thing. Like that example of the Numina, of going to that woodland glade or the beach or wherever it may be, and encountering the spirit there and having the sense of wonder and marvellousness of the spirit. That's one thing. But it can also relate to manufactured objects. So I mentioned totem pole and a shaman's drum, a sword, a spear, cauldron, an article of clothing, a cloak or something. There's mythology is full of examples, anthropology is full of examples of ritualistic objects from cultures the world over. Museums are stuffed to the gunnels with them, of objects that are believed to have this kind of spirit, this presence, this magic, this wonder to them, this oomph. And putting aside the naturally occurring objects, thinking about the manufactured objects, we're back to this idea of the demiurge. You create that sword or that totem pole or that drum or that cloak or whatever the thing is. You make it, you pour yourself into it, you invest yourself into it. It becomes part of you, you become part of it. And it could last a damn sight longer than you last, and you could be dead and buried for years, and that object is still being utilised by other people hundreds of years into the future. It's become part of an ongoing presence. And that's back to that kind of ancestral notion of the human mind, death merging into the collective, completely merging into the collective unconscious, the individual becoming part of the collective, not only in the sense of leaving behind their memories, their knowledge, their understandings and the rest of it, but sometimes in actual objects which contain the oomph, the essence, the prana, the mana, the chi, whatever the hell you want to call it, of the person who manufactured it, and has left their essence within it, and now it's been inherited by a distant relative, or it's sitting on a shelf in a museum or wherever it might be, and it has its life of a sort. And the importance then becomes to understand it as it has separated from the individual who created it, which is part of paganism, is that kind of interacting not only with organic living beings, but also interacting with presences, with psyches that are part of non-organic life, manufactured life, if you like. And to recognise that they too have their needs and their wants and their wishes and their agency, if you want to get a little bit sociological, about agency, free will, choice, power, control, but of a somewhat different order than the kinds of choices and powers and what have you exercised by human beings. So something that has been created by a human, imbued by a human, but then becomes something other than, more than, different from a human as time goes past. Does anyone have any questions? I'm talking myself into a corner here on this one. Or comments, anything you agree with, or anything you think is complete cobblers? Or anything you had experience of yourself that you'd like to flag up? Or indeed any questions about any aspects of Jung that I haven't covered or I didn't explain very clearly, that you'd like gone over in more detail. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions appearing. That could be because people are not as fast at typing as I am at talking. Okay. Well, I think I'm going to draw to, and it's 4:30 now, so a little bit shorter time-wise than the 5 o'clock finish I posted on the Facebook page. But I think I've covered the main points that I wanted to cover. So I'll witter for a little bit more just to give people a chance to type. Thank you, Sarah. Do you mean entranced in the sense of bored into a hypnotic state? So if I witter for a little bit longer, another 5-10 minutes, just to kind of round up, summarise, that will hopefully provide people with a chance to type any questions or what have you that they want to, because I appreciate that formulating your thoughts and getting them typed up is not the quickest thing in the world. So a question from Maurice about Jung's views being influenced by Plato. It is basically the theory of forms given a twist and a new life. In the archetypes, to a point, are essentially like Platonic theories of forms. They are forms in a sense. The difference, I suppose, really is that Plato, I want to explain that actually, there might be people sitting here listening to this thinking, what the hell is Plato's theory of forms? Plato, back 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece, argued that, should I think of an example? Let's say a cup. Here we go, here's a cup. A cup is an idea in a sense. Obviously, this is ceramic or whatever it's made out of. But someone had to have an idea to make this cup in the first place, and what shape it should be, and what shape the handle should be, and what colour, and the logo, and all of this. So this started out as an exercise of imagination for someone, before it ended up as an actual physical object. We have an idea of a cup. Now, our idea of a cup is it's a kind of a collective idea that we as a culture, not just British culture, because obviously there's cups in every country on earth, but we have ideas in our respective cultures as to what cups should look like. So maybe one of those, I don't know what the correct Japanese word is, but one of those little cups they have in Japanese tea ceremonies, and so on, which wouldn't hold much. It's obviously not the size of this thing. This is what I call a tea mug. One of those little things that they have for the ceremonies is not what I'd call a cup, but clearly it is a cup. It's an understanding of cups. So different cultures have different ideas as to what cups are. And Plato argues that the very notion of a cup exists at this sort of spiritual level of existence, where there are these things called forms. The ideal cup, the ideal table, the ideal curtains, the ideal dog, the ideal elephant. It exists at that level. And when it comes to someone thinking, oh, I'm going to make a cup now, their mind taps in to this spiritual level, which is kind of like the collective unconscious, and they get a sense of cuppiness. The what is a cup? What is it for? What is it like? How can I make it? The ideas, the cultural collective ideas of cup, come through from this spiritual level into the mind of the individual potter or cup making person, who then creates a type of cup which is based upon this centralized notion within the spiritual level of existence as to what cups are, what they should be. And it does overlap with a much later idea. If we're thinking Bartlett or Piaget talking about schema, and their idea that a schema and a form kind of different ways of understanding the same thing, really. A schema is an idea of, well, what is a dog? Well, a dog is this four-legged furry thing that goes woof. But that notion of a four-legged furry thing that goes woof incorporates everything from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane, and a hell of a lot of variation in dogs. And we do know that sometimes you can see a three-legged dog or a two-legged dog. You can see a really hairy dog, or you can see a completely hairless dog. You can see dogs with tails and dogs without tails. So whatever feature you come up with that a dog is this, you can find a dog that's not that, but still a dog. And you could perhaps define, these days, you could define dog by some kind of genetic coding. But obviously for 99.9% of human history, we've had bugger all idea about genetics. And so we've defined dogs by a concept which is actually really, really hard to pin down as to precisely what constitutes a dog that is present in every single possible variation of a dog. So, dogs have four legs. Well, yeah, most of them do. But a three-legged dog is still a dog. Dogs have tails. Most of them do. But a tailless dog is still a dog. So we have, in other words, what is the absolute minimum, bare, central essence of dogness from which we have this mental category, this schema in our heads that says a dog is basically this. Oh, there's one. All those different things, big, short, fat, tall, furry, skinny, whatever, all of those are variations of dog. And so that's like Plato's idea that there is this form of dog, this ideal, perfect dog that exists as a concept, an idea, a spiritual notion, of which every of the billion dogs in the world that have ever existed, every single one of them is a manifestation of, a rendition of, a version of that perfect core dogginess. Is it an archetype in the same sense? Well, Plato isn't or wasn't arguing for consciousness or awareness, that these forms were aware of them. He wasn't saying the forms knew of themselves. I mean, I know I exist. I have self-awareness. Presuming everyone listening to this has self-awareness. Plato wasn't saying this archetypal, idealized form of dog knows that it exists. It's a nebulous concept rather than it's not like the god of dogs or anything like that. Jung attributed a kind of limited awareness to archetypes. They're not self-aware in the way that you and I are, but they have a life of their own that transcends any individual human being, and they can overwhelm a human being. Concept he referred to as inflation, nothing to do with economics and money and so on. During inflation, it's a bit like sticking your fingers in the plug socket. You tap into an archetype, and like the kid with their fingers in the plug socket, it overwhelms you with energy and drowns you, and you lose your individuality. So going back to what I was prattling on about earlier with Apollo being, yes, he is a sun god, but he's more than that, and he partakes of an archetype, but is more than an archetype. Each of us is more than any one single archetype. But when you experience inflation, one archetype so drowns you that you lose touch with all of the other bits of you. An example of it, and you would have to be at a certain age to get this reference, because there was a TV show, comedy, a couple of decades ago called Sorry, in which Ronnie Corbett played a librarian who lived with his mother and father, and his mother was this right old cow This treated him like he was 5 years old. In fact, everyone she met, she treated them like they were 5 years old. And the whole kind of joke of the comedy was that he was this middle-aged man living with mother who would treat him like he was 5 years old, and he was constantly trying to get independent and move out, and she was always undermining him and kind of didn't want to cut the apron strings, and it was this sort of battle between him and this domineering mother. If she were a real person rather than a fictional character in a TV show, and I'm sure there probably are real people a bit like that in the world, you could say that she is so overwhelmed by the archetype of the great mother that she cannot exist as anything other than a mother. So if she loses her child, she loses herself. Because a mother with no child is not much of a mother in that sense. Loses the raison d'etre of being a mother. The purpose of being a mother is to have the child and look after them. So when the child is gone, it's that empty nest syndrome. Who am I? What am I? Where am I anymore? And so it's when the season of the show, it went on for a few years. When it ended in the very last episode, he does move out. He gets married. He moves out, and she takes a lodger. The mother takes a lodger who is an even bigger drip than the Ronnie Corbett character was, and so she basically replaces her actual biological son with a sort of surrogate, drippy, pretend man-boy son that she can continue domineering and mothering him, smothering him forever and a day, because she cannot turn off the archetype of the great mother. And so she doesn't exist in any other context except as a mother. When that happens, and Jung said it, that obviously he was writing, so he died in 61, so he was writing a long time before BBC sitcom was in existence. There are people who tap into archetypes that so overwhelm them, they become like a cartoon character version of themselves, a rendition of the archetype, and they lose sight of who they really are, this much more complex person than this one little piddly archetype. The actor Jeremy Brett, who played Sherlock Holmes back in the 80s, 90s, fantastic actor. But his wife died and he had a nervous breakdown. And he felt that he was becoming so overwhelmed by Sherlock Holmes he'd lost sight of himself. And that even when he went home at the end of the day and they stopped filming, even when he went home, he was still being Sherlock Holmes. He couldn't kind of turn it off. He'd lost sight of Jeremy Brett and become this archetypal character. And he ended up in being sectioned at one point and needing psychiatric help and everything. So that you could take that as an example of someone who is drowned in an archetype and lost themselves. The process of winnowing it down, so you've been inflated and you want to get back to who you are, is called deflation. It's like taking the air out of the balloon and going back down to who you were again. You could link that in. I keep banging on about Wicca, and I've not really spoken about heathenry or druidry or Hermeticism or whatever. But you could, the idea in Wicca, and it's similar kind of thing done in other traditions, of calling down the goddess, or calling down the god, drawing down the moon, drawing down the sun, of inviting a deity in to take control of you, possess you for a few minutes, and speak through you as an oracle. So you become an oracle for the presence of the Candomblé and Samperia and various other religions around the world have these sorts of spirit riding experiences where someone becomes possessed, usually for a very short period of time, just a matter of a few minutes. They become possessed by a deity, and so the Joe Bloggs or whoever they really are switches off, and the deity takes over using their body, speaks through their mouth to communicate with the other worshippers. That could be seen as a very limited form of inflation, controlled because it ends and then they go back to being themselves again. If you couldn't end it, if you kind of called down that spirit and then you couldn't get rid of it, that would be a form of inflation. The Greeks had the idea of the daimones, which is something that Rollo May, who was another follower of Jung, wrote about years later. The demones, these kind of one-note emotional spirits, like hope and fear, hate and dread and laughter and so on, would take possession of people and then so overwhelm them, again a form of inflation, that they would go mad and they would lose themselves. And indeed, they saw mental illness as very frequently being, not always, but in quite a number of cases, being a form of this spirit possession by the demones, where the person had lost themselves and this entity had taken over their body and was kind of drowning their identity. And the goal was to try and sort of exercise, get the spirit out, usually by persuasion and bribery rather than anything else, and restore the individual to their self, to their more complex sense of who they are, and away from this overwhelming spirit that had drowned their sense of reality. Message from Carol. No, paganism is a set of belief systems, but infused with all belief systems, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, all belief systems are infused with psychology, because all belief systems primarily are dealing with the human experience and how we interact with each other, ethics, how we interact with the divine in whatever shape form it's envisioned, how we interact with other life on this planet, all of which is based on how we think, how we feel, how our minds operate. So every religion, I would say, is a form of psychological understanding, because every religion is about the human soul, the psyche, and therefore it's not academic psychology, which is a slightly different tangent and approach to the subject, but it's basically about understanding human nature. And it's more and how we interact with the world. So it's not only saying this is what the world is like, it's also saying this is what you're like, you human, and this is how you should try and develop, how you should evolve. Those bits of you where they're a bit odd, try and get them under control. These bits of you, they're really lovely, develop them more. And that's how you interact with the world. So, yeah, paganism is a belief system, but one infused with an understanding of psychology. In fact, you could, well, there's a lot of, I think there's more in common between the different forms of paganism in our understanding of things like animism and so forth, than there are differences. But I think it would be getting onto dodgy ground to assume automatically that the way Wiccans understand psychology is default the same as the way heathens do, or the way Hellenics do, or the way Comitics do, or the way Druids do. I'd say maybe different types of paganism have their own spin on understanding of human psychology and how we fit into the universe. So rather than paganism as a psychology, different types of paganism, different forms of expression. And so a bit about, can you mix both these systems? But it's inevitable. I think it's impossible not to mix them, because what's magic if not an understanding of psychology? What is soteriology, the doctrine of self-improvement? And how do I become a good person and a better person? What's that if not psychology? I suppose perhaps what this also boils down to as a 21st century stance is, can you mix ancient religion with specific types of modern psychology, like Freud or Skinner or Bandura or Dunlop or whoever? Yeah, you can, of course you can, absolutely. But clearly some systems of academic psychological thought are going to fit more readily with ancient pagan thought than others will. But absolutely there are interactions going on there. Are there any, got about 10-12 minutes left before this thing clicks itself off. Are there any other questions or comments, bits you agree with, bits you disagree with, or ideas that Jung chucked out that I haven't mentioned? Obviously he wrote a ton of stuff, so I've only just kind of skimmed the surface really. But there might be other things you would like to know about that I've not mentioned, or you think might be good to put in some future seminar if you haven't already been driven over the edge by this one. Carol suggested a couple of ideas earlier for future possible discussions. Thank you, Carol. It poses an interesting question. I'm assuming of the people listening at the moment, most of you are going to be pagan, but perhaps some of you are not. In saying that Jung based his ideas heavily on paganism, and actually he did a heavy drawing from Greek myth and Egyptian myth and so on. Is Jungian thought also compatible with Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Buddhism? I would say, on the whole, yes, but there are certain aspects of his thoughts that maybe would pose challenges with some religions, particularly his sense of universality. So the idea that there is much wisdom to find in all mythology, and all of it can be understood as psychodrama. If you've got a religious approach, let's say something like Calvinism, I'm pretty sure there's probably no Calvinists actually listening to this. Calvinism is a very exclusive path in that it says we are right and everyone else is deluded by the devil. If you believe that, then you'd probably be very uncomfortable sitting within an academic school of thought that says all religion has truth to it, all mythology has truth to it. If you're very kind of up your own arse and think that only your brand of religion is true and everyone else is a deluded nutcase, then Jung probably wouldn't go down terribly well. But for the majority of religions, I think he would fit pretty well. So, question from Sarah: do you feel that attaining psychological balance awareness is needed to develop in spiritual? In the long term, yes. If somebody only started on paganism last Thursday, I don't think they need to be getting their knickers in too much of a twist about attaining balance today. So it's a thing you work towards, in other words, rather than an immediate, oh God, I've started, I must be balanced by next Monday. If you rush towards balance, you'll fall flat on your face. But as a kind of a long-term goal within paganism, if, let's say, you started as a pagan at 20 and you live to be 85, if you get to your deathbed at 85 and you're laying there gasping your last, and you're as big as of a wanker at 85 as you were at 20, then you've done something wrong. You've missed the point somewhere along the line. You should be a better person. After having followed pagan teachings for 65 years, you should be a better person by the end of it than you were at the start. And if you're not, you fucked up. So in the long term, yes, you should become a better person, but obviously, the long term, gradual, rather than expecting, as maybe we live in this very kind of instant gratification society of the 21st century, where people go and buy a self-help book, read it on Monday and expect to be perfect on Friday. That's an unwise route to go down, and you get rather commercialised forms of paganism that pander to that a little bit. That is very naive. So it's not an instant cure. And it does concern me, and I do see this in a number of other religions that I've kind of have friends in and kind of involvements with. So it's not only a pagan thing by any stretch of the imagination, but there are quite a few people who use religion as cheap therapy. That they are disturbed people with severe problems, often quite narcissistic, and they will join a religious movement, and they're less interested in being better people, making the world a better place, communing with deity, learning, understanding about life, the universe, etc. Less interested in that than they are in going on and on and on about their hang-ups and their anxieties and their problems, and expecting some kind of instant fix for that. So I think there's a concern that some people can treat religion as cheap therapy, and that's, whilst it will make you a better person, it's not centred on being a form of therapy. And that bit about going down into the darkness and coming back up, That I think is key, that you go in, you become a better person, and then you get off your arse and you make the world a better place. You don't just sit there like a lump. You become actively involved in making life nicer for other people too, human people and non-human people. And someone who's very narcissistic is it's all about me, me, me. There's very little about can I make the world a nicer place? Can I benefit others? And that, I think, is where religion and therapy don't always need, because ideally good therapy should put someone in a position where they can go and make the world a better place. But there's a lot of therapy out there which isn't very good, let's face it. Religion should have as a central drive, at least pagan religion should, most religion probably should, that push will help you to help the world. Your becoming a better person is part of an ongoing process of making the world a better place. It's not just a little tiny box of you, it's out of that as well. Jung and shamanism. Okay, I'll put my brain into gear, and once I've got past this big doodah we've got going on at work, then I'll try and sort something on that front, Carol. Oh, thank you, Kevin. Nice to know you enjoyed. Good. Essentially, yeah, Kevin, it is the roadmap towards individuation. This is about the attainment of Rubredo, that final of the four alchemical stages, where Zizigi is you become yourself with a capital S. So you become this whole being rather than this fractured, imbalanced, wonky table that doesn't quite do its job properly. You become a balanced person. You become yourself, and that is the process of individuation. But I was saying that it's not a static process, that you can individuate today and then 5 years down the line stuff happens and you're struggling. So it's not, I've managed it to stay there for the next 30 years of my life, are going to be laughing. It's an ongoing, you don't kind of, it's not a straight line. That's quite a pagan idea. It's cyclical. Goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down. So it's not I'm up here and then I stay up here. It's I'm up here and then at some point I'll go there and then I'll go there and then I'll go. So it's understanding that life is an ongoing process of individuation. You keep doing until the day you're dead. And if like me, you believe in reincarnation, tough shit, you're probably still doing it after you're dead. It doesn't even end at the grave. It goes on and on and on as this endlessly ongoing process. But the kind of linking between this and reincarnation is a whole thing in and of itself. And that starts to go quite way beyond Jung's notions and ideas on that one. Oh, glad you enjoyed it. Take care, Catherine. Yeah, I'd go along with that, Carol, that it should be a deeper connection rather than just dogma and ranting. I know I spent 3 hours ranting and raving at you, but ideally pagan teachings in the endless variations of paganism are more about connection than about dogma and hardline thumping to a set of teachings. So it should be a lot more flexible. And I agree, a very large gin. Absolutely, I think I've probably stuffed enough cake down my gob for one day. Certainly the gin would not go amiss at the moment because my throat is getting a little bit ropey, and we are up to the last 2 minutes. So I don't know if this turns off automatically or I have to turn it off, but we'll see what happens in 2 minutes. In theory, this will upload itself to that Facebook page for the APC thingy-bob. Mood Talks, that's the word I'm looking for. And then, if I don't know why you'd want to listen to this again once you've probably enough, but you might have friends who would be interested in at least bits of it if they wanted to click onto that link, listen to it. And by all means, if you want to send the link to someone and say, oh, well, this might help you in what you're doing, or cue your insomnia, or whatever you want to say to them, by all means do share that link out. Question from Carol. Yeah, well, that's my feeling exactly, Carol, that individuation needs more than one lifetime. That's why, well, one of the reasons I think reincarnation is not only convincing in terms of memories and experiences and things that people have, but it makes sense to me that nothing in the cosmos truly gets destroyed. It gets transformed and revived into a different shape, a different form, including dead people, I think. And therefore, individuation could take 50, 60, 100, 1,000 lifetimes to actually do, which is very much a Vedic idea as well, with Sikhism and Hinduism and Jainism and so on, that this is a hell of a long process that they're on. And it's this life, this lump of flesh, is one tiny little blip in that experience. It's just a costume my soul is trying on at the moment, and there have been 100 other costumes in the past and 100 other costumes in the future before I get to something like individuation. Oh, good. I might induce a few laughs. So 5 o'clock, so take care, and I will see if I can work out what on earth to do with this. And if you do come up with any other questions I haven't answered, just email me, and I'll get back to you at some point. Take care.